Yeah, we'll get started with the RDA meeting for Tuesday, January 19th, 2021.
Okay.
You want to put the, there we go. As board chair for the redevelopment agency of Murray, I've determined that due to the continued rise in COVID-19 case counts, holding an in-person meeting with the anchor location presents a substantial risk to the health and safety of those in attendance. Under these circumstances, Utah State Code 52-4-2074 allows for electronic meetings to be held without an anchor location as long as the public has an opportunity to view the meeting and submit public comment. We are holding today's RDA meeting via video conference, and the meeting is being live streamed at www.murraycitylive.com. To the RDA, please do so via the email at rda@murray.utah.gov. Thanks, Melinda. Okay, we'll start the meeting with the approval of the December 8th, 2020 RDA meeting minutes and the approval of January 5th RDA 2021 minutes. Do I have any additions, deletions, corrections?
Dale, do you want to take them together? Is that okay?
Yeah, why don't we take them together?
Any.
There's no
if there are no changes. Okay, then I'll make a motion to approve the RDA minutes for December 8th, 2020 and January 5th, 2021.
I'll second.
Sorry.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Brooke? No Brooke? All in favor, say aye.
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 Are there any opposed? All right, the motion passes. Next, we'll move to citizen comments. Do we have any citizen comments, Melinda?
We do. Jay's going to read the couple of comments that we received.
Okay, thank you.
This first one is from Kate Sturgeon. It says, Dear Mayor Camp, City Council, Redevelopment Agency, Mr. Hall, Ms. Lopez, Ms. Greenwood, and others mentioned within, but I was unable to find an email address for whomever makes traffic decisions for the city. This is a long list with multiple areas of concern, but these are the things on my neighbors and my minds regarding the city's move forward with recent planning options and decisions. My true angst is seeing what former Mayor Dan Snar's vision for Murray becoming just like every other city between Salt Lake and Provo coming to fruition. Our taxes, utility rates, crime rates are all rising. Services are not keeping pace with increased demand, and now mixed use zoning is being considered in places where it shouldn't. Jared Hall of the zoning department got down to basics for mixed use. Money, or as he said, better reward with mixed use than with individual homes or small businesses. The charm of what used to be Murray is rapidly disappearing with new replacement projects. Murray has the advantage of being in the heart of the valley with some of the last large parcels of redevelopable land. No one is making any more land. As the real estate axiom goes, it's location, location, location. Gone, or should be gone, are the days of the Murray's inferiority complex of accepting any old proposal from the first taker. When I moved here in 1990, a mayoral candidate was dancing ecstatic that the last parcel in Murray has been sold, because back then Murray wasn't the place to be and you couldn't give it away. Fast forward 30 years and you, as city leaders, managers, and the ones who shape the future of our city, have the unique opportunity to make this redevelopment into something to be proud of and not just another identical cookie cutter suburb with uninspired cloned architecture. Where is a welcoming entrance to Murray? Certainly not State Street, not Vine Street, which after the recent redo from 900 East to 1300 East is just a heat absorbing, then reflecting treeless multi-lane mess. Heading in from the industrialized west, not there either. 900 East isn't particularly pretty until one reaches 5900 South in Winchester, the very mixed area use that is being considered where new businesses and Wheeler Farm are. Winchester itself is a 5-lane speedway with its own set of issues. Trees are the cheapest and easiest way to improve aesthetics, as well as help cool a city. It seems the design trend of late is to butt projects up to the sidewalk, therefore increasing heat-absorbing surfaces with no return benefit, i.e. harnessing all that solar power for positive return, and thus negating any possibility for a shady spot. Examples, the corner of Vine Street and State with hotels, mixed-use zoning, the new project at Winchester and 520 East, the proposed new mixed-use building, residents exiting the subdivision behind the new construction at 520 East Winchester have obscured vision of oncoming traffic as a result of 7-foot walls abutting the sidewalk. Whoever approved the sightlines needs to review reality and not wishful thinking. It may meet established guidelines, but no one goes the speed limit or under on Winchester. Murray Police Department could make bank issuing speeding citations there. I ask for better coordination between the planning department and traffic study group to go on site to witness reality and not go by what a book says should work. And in searching Murray's website for emails, I was surprised to learn Murray has a shade tree and beautification commission. Why are they not involved in planning decisions? They seem rather neutered at present. One would think the tree lesson was learned when Fashion Place Mall took out all its mature trees to xeriscape. Previously, the walk around there was almost pleasant, but no longer. One must use their car to access the shopping center across the street or move anywhere in that area. Local residents are also ripping out their mature trees. I think we will learn a sad lesson as the summers heat up more and more, and there's less and less respite from the relentless sun. Walkability. In Murray, overall has suffered as well, but specifically pre-COVID, children in the James Point apartments across Winchester, a 5-lane freeway, to get to their elementary school. Not all children head to the 725 East stoplight. Just as cars don't always adhere to the speed limits, children don't always take the approved route. The UDOT's blinking light straddling 900 East at Wheeler Farms is just as dangerous because the pedestrian can't see when the lights are flashing, thereby safe to cross. A simple walk light coordinated with the flashing lights would mitigate that. Longview Elementary children use that space to cross 900 East for their Wheeler Farm field trips. Putting mixed-use zoning at the corner of 900 East and Winchester doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit with the current aesthetic of Murray and the established residential neighborhoods surrounding this plat. The corner of 900 East and Winchester is not Fort Union yet. Please don't turn it into that. Logic would say that it makes far more sense to continue in the vein of the offices which line 900 East from 59 South to Winchester on the west side. They're attractive and should be producing tax revenue for the city. It also keeps in line the quasi-residential look that up to 360 units mixed zoning can't. Correct the error which was made 50 years ago when R.C. Willey was permitted to locate its building there. One error needn't be replaced by another. Mixed use makes far more sense in the sea of asphalt between 5900 South and 6100 South and State Street, which is the Shopco pad, the old Toys R Us pad, or Van Winkle and 5600 South. It makes far more sense to happen in those locales where restaurants and ground floor businesses would be welcome. Green space could replace heat absorbing asphalt. Murray has lots of those kinds of eyesores, which would make far more sense to change zoning to mixed use than sticking one in an established residential area. In looking at the plans for the 4800 South State Street development and reading the proposal submitted by the architectural firm, it states that the minimum parking requirements have been met. So before the cement has cured, there will already be overflow parking issues. This project uses today's standards, and since the building will have a shelf life of 30 to 50 years, parking will be grossly inadequate for decades to come. We are currently dealing with the effects of poor parking planning with the Lawyer Building at the corner of 725 East Winchester. Cars from that complex spill out onto 725 East and are not contained within the business's lot. That building complex is only a few years old and we already have serious issues there. And that they threatened to sue the city when asked to do something indicates a serious error was made. Can we please learn from it? Murray's website is chronically out of date. There's nothing of substance on Murray's website. RE Fashion Place West Small Area Plan. If one wants to become educated on the happenings in Murray's government, isn't its website the first stop for citizens to educate themselves regarding projects being considered? Informing a wider area than only those within a 300 or 500 adjacent perimeter of actions under city consideration would be incredibly helpful as well. The current 300 to 500 foot notice limits Murray citizen engagement regarding the future of the city. Thank you for letting me air some issues with it, which have been building, no pun intended, of late. Granted, COVID hasn't helped. When discussing some of the above with a neighbor, he asked, "Where are they meeting so I can go?" Not having a clue that meetings have been held online for months. But also not helping is Murray City making these decades-long impacting decisions without the input of its citizens, simply they were under consideration. Good communication is essential in every walk of life, and none more so than local government with its citizens. Sincerely yours, Kate Sturgeon, 569 East, 6295 South, Murray, Utah, 84107, 30-year resident.
Okay, thank you. Do we have more? I granted a longer one for that one because I felt it was important that she be able to express her feelings. Do we have any more?
We do. Just a minute.
The next two will be in person with participants in the webinar. But give us just a minute and I'll give the two speakers the ability to speak.
It is not letting me elevate them to participant.
Okay, I think I can do it, Jay. Hold on.
I'm not host anymore.
Okay, I think I can do it. Hang on. So Alex, I'm going to start with you, and you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Perfect. You can hear me?
Yes.
Jay made it a point to remind me of the 3-minute time restriction. I took that as a challenge. So let me get into it. My name is Alexander Teamsma. I live at 10 West Miller Street, Murray, Utah, District 1. Hello, Redevelopment Agency. Hope you all are doing well. Thank you for the work you're doing. Excuse me. I just want to share a few thoughts regarding the proposed Girding Edlin development in the Murray City Center District. I tried to do a little research on Girding Edlin. Their website is not working for me right now. However, I was able to look into their brewery blocks development in Portland. Apologies if I'm sharing information you already know. So Girding Edlin did an absolutely awesome job with the first Regiment Armory Annex, which is now Portland Center Stage at the Armory. Wikipedia says that the Armory has become a significant case study for historic preservation and sustainable design. I have confidence that Girding Edlin can do the same in Murray City, striking a balance between innovative, sustainable development while highlighting the beauty of nearby historically significant properties. That being said, the concern I would like to share is how the proposed development in the MCCD, aside from aesthetics, will affect the character of the downtown and Murray as a whole. As I understand it, Girding Edlin will decide what businesses will occupy the retail and dining fronts. It's The Brewery Blocks website shows that there are 27 retail and dining spaces shared between the 5 blocks. And of the 27 retail and dining spaces at the Brewery Blocks, 2 are unoccupied and 20 are national brands, such as the North Face, Lululemon, Starbucks, Serve La Table. The remaining 5, per my count, include the theater, a framing store with 7 locations, limited to the Pacific Northwest, known as Frame Central, 2 restaurants, and Rochelle M, which is a fashion specialty store with 3 locations throughout Oregon. So more than 80% of the retail fronts are leased to large businesses with no specific ties to Portland or even Oregon. While the selection of stores may have been influenced by the fact that Portland is a larger city, larger than Murray City anyway, it would seem Girding Edlin could do more to prioritize leasing to locally owned restaurants and stores. Or maybe smaller businesses wouldn't be able to afford the leases. Regardless, the selection process of lessees for the future development in downtown Murray is something that ought to be reevaluated. The types of businesses that fill those spaces will have long-lasting implications for the character of downtown Murray. I look at downtown Provo as an inspiration for the things Murray could do, and of the 133 retail and dining options listed on their website, I could count on one hand the number of national brands. Murray has plenty of big box store and national brand and chain representation throughout this mall. I am unsure of the legality of influencing the selection of leasees, but maybe a provision can be made in the MCCD guidelines, or the deal with Girding Edlin can be negotiated to include specific requirements for retail and dining space leasees. For example, approval from the RDA. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. Janice, I will move to you next. Give me just a second. Okay, you should be able to unmute yourself now, Janice.
And there, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Thanks, everyone. Hey, I want to give a big support to what Alex said. I think he made some really valid points about what will be a real draw for the downtown, national chains versus local. Okay, so hello board, city leaders and staff. You guys know me. I've been a Murray resident living in the historic neighborhood just east of downtown Murray for 27 years. Even though I was not raised here, I feel my roots have dug deep into this amazing community. And I really want to commend each of you for the diligent work you are doing to help move Murray into the future. There is a lot of responsibility in the decisions you are asked to make now, knowing these changes can forever alter Murray and will last for generations. I appreciate your desire to build on the solid foundation created by those who have gone before you. Today and ongoing, as the board reviews the Edlin project proposal and others, I ask the board to carefully consider these questions. A hallmark of Murray's beginnings was its diversity, welcoming people from all walks of life and creating a unique downtown. How is this project enhancing diversity and building on what makes Murray one of a kind? Does this project promote diversity in both population and businesses? Okay, that's my first set. Next set. Highly valued components of an engaging and vibrant downtown are local businesses, mom and pop shops, and startup companies. And how does this project support and encourage these businesses to come to downtown Murray? And again, now I'm going to quote from the proposed design review guidelines for the MCCD that are under value 1, authentic. Quote, development in the MCCD area should be thoughtful, purposeful, and representative of the true heart of Murray City. When someone travels along State Street and reaches the buildings which have close proximity to the street between 4800 South and Vine Street, they know they have arrived in Murray, end quote. So question, Does this project harmonize with the surrounding built environment that has been the mark of arriving here in Murray? And always to ask, will such a development enhance or detract from Murray's charm? I thank you for your time, and as a citizen of Murray, I really do trust that you will be ever diligent in your responsibility for honoring what has made Murray what it is today and building upon that identity as we move into a bright future. Thank you.
Thanks, Janice. Okay, Emily, I will, give me just a second. I will give you the opportunity to speak. And then Jay, we did just have another email come through. So when Emily's done, if you want to read that one. Oh dear. Shoot, we just lost Emily. I'm not sure what happened there. Jay, if you want to just read that, the one that
Sure.
just came in, and maybe let's give Emily a minute to rejoin.
Okay. This Dear Board, the Murray Area Chamber of Commerce is excited to see our local government's continued investment into the economic development of Murray's downtown. This part of our city has the potential to be a humming engine of commerce, and the plans put forward by the contractor the board has selected look like a great balance of uses that will make it a destination for residents and businesses alike. As the process moves from the conceptual to the practical phases, the Chamber is hopeful that the business will be an active participant in the development discussion. We are confident that our insight into Murray's economy will help make the project as engaging and productive part of our community as possible. Sincerely, Joseph Silversweig, Board Member, Murray Area Chamber of Commerce.
Okay, let me just check and see. I have not seen her enter in again. And I fear I may have accidentally right-clicked on removing her from the meeting instead of allowing her to talk. So I just have emailed her, and if it's okay with you, Chairman, if she responds back and enters the meeting again, could we allow her to speak later on in the meeting?
Absolutely. If she hooks back up, citizen comments are very important to all of us. So if we get her back on, let's interrupt whatever we're doing and give the time to her.
Okay, I'm not sure that's what happened, but if it is, that's like my worst case fear ever. So I just resent her confirmation email for registering for the meetings, and I've emailed her personally as well. So we'll see if we can get her back on, and my apologies for that.
Oh, that's all right. We'll move on. Do we have any others?
It does not look like it.
Okay, why don't we move on to the workshop presentation and discussion. And if she comes back on, feel free to interrupt and let's go to her.
Okay. Jay, while I'm presenting, can you just maybe look for that and try and contact her as well?
I'll keep an eye out for her.
Okay, thank you. All right, let me share my screen. Okay, hold on. Okay. When we met earlier this month with the chair and the vice chair, they suggested, or actually I think it was in December, they suggested that we have a workshop to discuss with the RDA board as an entire entity some of the history of what's happened with the Central Business District and the MCCD zone since the property we've been looking at that the RDA owns at 4800 South State Street is in the Central Business District and the MCCD zone. So we've taken some time to put together some slides here that should give you just kind of like a brief history of how we got here and some of the things that lay ahead of us with the project and where we anticipate going from here. So I wanted to just give a real brief overview of the Central Business District. It was formed in 1979. That's probably before a couple of our council members were even born.
Hey, Melinda,
Yeah.
are you okay to take questions for anybody as we go, or you want to say?
Oh yeah, yeah, please. If you, yes, please. If you have questions along the way, please just interrupt and ask.
Okay, thank you.
I also should say that I've got Jared here with me that later on in the presentation, he'll kind of walk through the process and what'll happen from here on out based on what the MCCD ordinance says. So yes, feel free to ask questions if you have any. So as I was saying, the Central Business District, or the CBD, was formed in 1979. It initially was given a 32-year time frame for the project period or for the project area to be active. It was triggered in 1983. I think I was in the second grade. So with that 32-year time period, the initial expiration was set to be in 2014. In 2010, the city and the RDA went through the process to have the project area extended for another 20 years. And that has the area since it would have initially expired in 2014. So all total, the project area, when it is concluded, will have had 54 years, if my math is correct. Brenda can check me on that. I wanted to go over just a little bit of background too with the MCCD zone. We had a lot of changes to this recently, and some of that is really what led us to be where we are right now. But in 2018, we had a project come forward that was presented to the RDA board. This was prior to my time, but the project was presented to the RDA board, and at the time, the MCCD zone had unlimited height allowed, so no height restrictions were in place. And the RDA board at that time did not really want to see something that tall come forward and be constructed. So in 2018, I think it was in August of 2018, the city council amended the MCCD zone and removed that unlimited height provision and added in a height restriction to 135 feet or 10 stories. So that was changed in 2018. I started with Murray City in 2019, and part of what I was tasked with when I first started was to kind of look at the area in the downtown and see what may have led to no growth or development taking place there. And so we, as a division, reviewed our ordinance, and in early 2019, I sent out a survey to the RDA board / city council, asking them some of the most important elements of the MCCD. And based on that survey, then we held a workshop in, I think it was kind of mid-spring of 2019, where we had the opportunity to go more in depth into dialogue of some of the survey results and some of the directions that that we could go in that might be more helpful to have development take place versus really the 40 years that the property in the State Street area, the Central Business District, has kind of sat and not really had a lot of development. So based on those conversations, we moved forward with an ordinance revision that we started in the summer of 2019. And in November of 2019, we brought that revised ordinance forward to the City Council for adoption. And the main points that we had with the ordinance revision was that we wanted to simplify the process in the ordinance. We wanted to modify the historic preservation portion, which really had been seen and viewed as a barrier to having development take place. And so based on those two things, we brought forward an ordinance to the City Council. The recommendation that we had from staff actually removed the MCCD Design Review Committee, but the Planning Commission felt like that was an important part of the ordinance to keep, and ultimately the City Council agreed with that. So there was an ordinance that was passed in November of 2019, and the ordinance kept the MCCD DRC, but also kept the modifications that we had proposed on the historic preservation and simplifying the process in other areas. We didn't modify any of the height, but mainly just simplified the process. And we also that year had gone through the process to modify the ordinance from the requiring of sustainability through the name brand of the LEED process to allowing the state high performance building process to be followed as an alternative. So those were the changes that we made in 2019. And that led us really to the ability for us in 2020 to put forward an RFP for the property that the RDA owns at 4800 South State Street. So I want to just go over some of the details that we had, or some of the details regarding the RFP. On March 21st of last year, we brought a draft of the RFP to the board through our attorney-client privilege to review the RFP before we put it out to public for opening the process for proposals. And based on some of our history with the downtown area and development that we've had in the past that didn't come to fruition, we wanted to be really cautious with the RFP process and make sure that we protected the integrity of that process. So when we sent the draft of the RFP to the board for comment, we sent that under attorney-client privilege. We received comments back from the board a few days later on March 25th. And then I sent a memo to the RDA board on April 7th that addressed some of the comments that we had received and how we followed up with those comments. We ended up opening the RFP on April 6th, 2020. It was open for 90 days, give or take. It closed on July 10th. And during that time, we only allowed communication through the state's website for the state's procurement website. So again, we wanted to maintain the integrity of the RFP and make sure that if there were questions that were asked, that they were asked through that system so that we could track and monitor those questions and then give the same information to all of the people who were interested in responding to the RFP. I personally sent the RFP out to probably over 100 different developers and groups that may have hopefully had an interest in that. The RFP closed, again, as I said, on July 10th. We received a total of 5 proposals.
Sorry. Yeah. How many of those, how many people outside of the state did you send the RFP to in terms of developers, or was it just in state?
It was both. I couldn't tell you, I'd have to go back and look. But we had a list of a bunch of developers that we've been tracking within the planning division that we know have done work within the state, even if they were out of state. And a lot of the developers that we know have done work in Murray. So I think honestly, probably most of them were local developers, but I know, for instance, that I sent one to Center Cal. I think oddly enough, Eadlin was not one of those that was on my list, but that's the beauty of using the state's procurement website, is that they themselves have a list. Individuals will go in, firms, architectures, developers will go in, and they will create an account in that site. And basically they'll go in and kind of select, here's the type of RFPs that we're interested in. And so that could have been, how some of them received word of that, but we did our best to try and get the word to local developers and those that we know have done work in Utah primarily. So that's a great question. Thanks for asking. Again, we received 5 proposals that we deemed to be responsive. That means that they met all of the requirements that the RFP had in place. And we took those proposals, then we worked again alongside with GL Critchfield as our legal counsel, and with our procurement specialist with Brooke Smith to create a committee and to communicate to the committee the proposals. And to initially we went through, we gave each of the committee members a scoring sheet. They went through those, and we created a short list of firms that we wanted to bring back and have in-person discussions with. So again, wanting to make sure that we maintained the integrity of the entire process from start to finish. We had the interviews. They were with the 2 firms that we selected to be shortlisted. Those were held in September. And at the end of the day, the discussion, the entire committee had the same firm to forward to the RDA as the top firm to be considered for approving the exclusive negotiation agreement. I think that date is correct. So on November 19th, then we brought that firm, the Eadlin Company, forward to the RDA agreement, negotiated with them, and that passed as a vote of 3-2. I should add that kind of through the middle of this, the proposal came in undergirding Eadlin, but they let us know through our discussion period that they were changing the name of their company essentially, and that's now the Eadlin Company is who we've selected. So again, that vote was sent to was passed by the RDA board as a vote of 3-2. So one of the things that we wanted to discuss with the board today and have a dialogue about is the kind of what we anticipate going forward from here on out. And some of the topics that we've selected for discussion were based on some of the comments that we heard from the RDA board, as you discussed the exclusive negotiation agreement on the November 19th meeting, and some of the comments and questions that came out of the presentation that Eadlin gave to you all. So again, one of the things that we wanted to communicate was what the MCCD regulates and what kind of is regulated by market considerations. So the MCCD ordinance does regulate quite a few things, and that's where we go back and say, okay, density is already regulated by what we have on the books with the ordinance. And so up to 100 units, Jared can correct me if I'm wrong, but up to 100 units per acre is allowed at this area or on this property. The height is also already regulated by the ordinance. We discussed that a little bit earlier, that a couple of years back, the RDA board and the council didn't like what they saw, and so they changed that. Public improvements are also regulated by the ordinance, meaning open space, meaning the size of sidewalks. Another item that's already regulated by the MCCD ordinance is parking. And we'll discuss parking a little bit more in detail in a few minutes, but also uses are governed by the MCCD ordinance right now. At one point last year, we had an individual come forward and want to put a manufacturing plant in the MCCD zone, and we needed to let them know that that wasn't an allowed use in the MCCD zone. So those uses are already set by the ordinance, and then designed to a limited scale or to a limited point is set by the ordinance as well. So that's where you're going to get your building scale. That kind of goes to setbacks, and then the ordinance requires that the buildings be constructed with traditional materials, and so that's where you're going to get like your requirement to have mostly glass on the bottom floor, so you have that pedestrian scale, and then the process is also regulated by the MCCD ordinance. Some of the things that have been discussed also are dictated by market or financial conditions, and these would be specific to whatever developer we choose to move forward with. In this case, that's Eadlin Company. So Eadlin has their own business model. They have their own group that they use for figuring out their financing, and they will do market studies. Any developer is going to come in and do market studies, and that's what dictates a large extent for density and height. Now, you'll notice again, we talked about those, that the MCCD ordinance dictates those as well. And so if a developer were to come back and say, well, we can't make this project pencil out, we need to go to 200 feet, we can say, well, sorry, that's not allowed by our height, and so by our height regulations, and so you need to, reconfigure your financing or do whatever you need to on your end to make that pencil out, or the project just doesn't move forward. It's the same thing with density as well. If a developer came back and said, look, we can only make this project pencil out at 200 units per acre, and it only allows 100 units per acre, then that's just a project that can't go forward with the way they envision it to be, because the ordinance. Same goes for if they were to come back and say, okay, we want to push the limits and we want to have a 135-foot building. That's something that we would need to allow because the ordinance already dictates that. And same with the density. Another, just kind of a side note, but the density is calculated based on the overall area of the site. And so if half of this, just as an example, if half of the site was used for a parking garage and the north half of the site was where the residential density was, the density would still be calculated over the entire site, which would include the parking area. So just because they were using, half of the northern half of a structure or of the property for the residential doesn't mean that they would be limited to just maybe those 2 acres on the north half where they were putting that. They would be calculated for the entire 4 acres where the parking was going as well as the residential. Some of the conversation that was brought up in November talked about, rental versus ownership of residential units. And that's something that really is dictated by the market, and something that really we should not get involved in. If we do, we would need to be prepared for some impacts to how a project would pencil out for a developer based on their own business model. So that's something that really is kind of dictated by the market and financial versus an ordinance, which is why we don't have that in the MCCD zone. Also, and this was mentioned in the public comments, but commercial space tenancy, that is dictated by the uses of the zone that are already spelled out in the MCCD. And so where, we could say, yes, we're looking for some type of a retail or a grocer, the dictating of exactly who goes into what spaces is just something that should be left up to the developer and to the market. And they will, be able to hopefully adjust the rates, the lease rates to the market that, would work to get those uses that we would desire. But at the end, that's really something that is up to them as the developer and the property owner to bring in those tenants. And then lastly, we want to just speak a little bit to design. So you notice we did mention, to a limited degree, design is dictated by the ordinance, and we'll talk a little bit more, Jared will talk a little bit more too about the design guidelines. But as far as, design, if somebody wanted to create something that was very reminiscent of the early 1900s State Street, that's not something really that we would dictate. If they wanted to create a project that was very modern, that's not something that we would dictate. That's really something that would be up to the developer.
But can you explain what's in the MCCD now design review guide? Because isn't that already dictated in the review or in the guidelines?
So to some extent, yes. And if it's okay with you, Board Member Dominguez, if we can kind of just if we can answer that question in a couple more slides when we get to that point, would that be okay? Okay, thanks. So this is really where I kind of want to talk a little bit about the process from here going forward. And Jared will be much more informed about answering your question, Chair, or excuse me, Board Member Dominguez, and discussing the process from here going forward. But again, I mentioned that the MCCD ordinance as it stands and as it was approved in November of 19 is what dictates the process be from here on out. And so we are anticipating that we would follow that process. Some of the comments, again, going back to the November meeting, revolved around a public input type of a process and getting public comments. That is something that we can do. That's something that Eadlin Company is willing to do. That is required as a separate piece to the process as it stands in the ordinance. So we do have a public process established for all of our projects that come through the MCCD, and they go through the design review committee and then the planning commission. And those meetings are publicly noticed. And at the planning commission level, there's an opportunity for the public to comment. But if it's okay, Jared, I'll just kind of turn the time over to you to go forward from here on out with kind of what the process looks like. And then if we can, maybe when we get to the design guidelines slide, address the question that Board Member Dominguez brought up just a moment ago.
Sure, no problem. So yeah, great. And then just jump in and ask any questions as you have them. Like Melinda mentioned, there is a process to every project that comes to the MCCD or in the MCCD zone, that being one of them, or the potential project there at 4800 South and State Street being one of them. The pre-application, so interestingly in the MCCD, every project is required to go through a pre-application conference, which means that the developers would spend some time with planning staff and potentially with other staff as well, talking through the application before it's fully formed, getting some input on the process, on the design standards, and getting an idea of what would be needed for a full application. When they do make that full application, that next step, the actual design review application, it used to be called Certificate of Appropriateness. In November of 2019, we changed that terminology to be design review application. When they make that full application, we would prepare to schedule it for that review. And that first step, as Melinda mentioned, is with the design review committee. To get ready to go to design review committee, we look for input from any city department staff that hasn't had a chance to comment yet in pre-application: engineering, fire, building department, water and sewer, everybody. And we get ready to go to design review committee. Design review committee, as Melinda mentioned, is a public meeting also. We make that available, but we don't take comments at the design review committee, although technically we don't. Sometimes we actually do. Just it's a more informal meeting. It's a good meeting. The design review committee will go over the project, and oftentimes at design review, it's referred back to the design review committee again for some changes, but sometimes it's just moved forward with a recommendation. They're a recommending body. They don't make any approvals. They recommend the project to the planning commission and say it needs this or that change, or with this condition, we're okay with it, etc. So after that design review committee has made their recommendation, it goes to the planning commission for a public hearing. That's noticed to neighboring property owners for certain distances, depending on the size of the project. And then that planning commission's review of the project and the recommendation of the design review committee is a public hearing. So we'll take comments from the public at that meeting as well. And then the planning commission has to make their decision. If you could go to the next slide, Melinda. As a part of that decision, the planning commission, there is in the code that was adopted in 2019, a kind of a standard of review for any design review approval that might be granted by the planning commission. So they're supposed to review it for conformance with the requirements of the title, meaning anything else that's contained in there, the landscaping regs, the planning, the parking regs, other processes. But then also that these other 5 items, that the project's in general conformance with the current general plan. So we do a general plan review and make sure that it's supporting and meeting those objectives and things, that it's in general conformance with any specific area plan that might encompass it. Depending again on the project's location, different project plans or area plans might be in effect. That third, that the project would conform to the requirements of the applicable sections of the land use ordinance. So again, it's kind of a catch-all. Title 17 applies, even though it's just in the MCCD zone. Fourth, that it doesn't jeopardize health, safety, or welfare, and that's a standard kind of a review standard. And then fifth, that the project's in harmony with the purpose of the MCCD zone, and that it adheres to the principles of the design guidelines. So these are the kind of things we'd be looking at as staff and the DRC to recommend to the commission that it either does or doesn't do these things. And the fifth item there, design guidelines, is one of the things that Board Member Dominguez mentioned. Can you go to the next slide, Melinda? I think we had something about the design guidelines. So the way that the current ordinance reads in the MCCD zone, it says the guidelines that have been adopted shall be consulted during the review of proposed development in order to provide guidance, direction, and options which will further the stated purposes of the MCCD. Wherever practicable, development should adhere to the objectives and principles contained in the design guidelines. And then I guess go to the next slide. We can talk about, I think, is there another slide about this, or yeah, no, actually go back to design guidelines. So right now we're in the midst of working on the adoption of the newer design guidelines, the new proposed design guidelines. The existing design guidelines have a lot of different aspects to them. All
Jared?
of those things. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you go to the last slide, the slide before this one?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
No, the one where it says where practicable.
Oh. Let's see. So it's going to be the design guidelines slide, Melinda, if you go. Yeah. So wherever practicable, the developments should adhere to the objectives and principles contained in the design guidelines. Is that the part you're talking about?
Yeah, what does that mean?
It's the statement being that where we're looking at it, it's just kind of an attempt to say where we're able to do it, these developments should adhere to these objectives and principles, meaning that you've got 50 pages of different principles. You shouldn't throw out a project just because they weren't able to check off every single box for every single one of those items. So there's going to be cases, there are going to be cases in developments where they're not, where you're able to point to it and say, well, it doesn't actually do that particular sub item in that particular design guideline, so we don't approve. That's not the intent of the design guidelines. It's supposed to be a standard of review where we're looking at them and consulting them and saying, look, this is an appropriate development because it does hit these basic tenets. That's the intent there, is to say it's not going to check off every single box. It's not going to be able to.
Jared,
Please go ahead.
this statement, I'm looking at the current design, what we have for MCCD is not in the current one. Is this in the new one, or what
Well,
page can I find this
Do
statement?
you mean in the design guidelines? Because this is in the code. This is in the MCCD zone.
Oh, it's in the code.
Yeah,
Okay.
this is in the actual ordinance in the MCCD zone in Title 17. So
Okay.
not in the guidelines themselves. This is just referring to those guidelines.
Okay.
Not from the code.
I was
Jared,
trying to get a clarification on
Yeah, no, you bet.
Jared, if I can interject
Sure.
on a couple points. So that's again another great question, Rosalba. Thank you. So this is pasted right from the code, and to go back to the changes that we made in the distinction between the November 19 MCCD zone that was adopted and what was on the books before, there were a lot of very stringent guidelines, and the code actually said that we shall follow the guidelines, which when you have that in an ordinance, it makes it non-negotiable and something that you have to do. So we felt like each project, each site should be evaluated on its own merits. And that's where, going to Board Member Turner's question, that's where the wherever practicable comes in. So as an example, one of the items that was in the code before was that there be an entrance to, like a ground level entrance to a building every 75 feet. And as we went through the City Hall review process, we realized that's not something that is always practicable. In this case, because of security issues with our police department, we can't have an entrance every 75 feet. If there were to be a large retailer like a grocery store, they may not be able to have an entrance every 75 feet. And so those are some of the changes that that we put in the ordinance, but there's kind of at least one example of how based on what an actual project is, how it comes forward to the DRC, how some of those design guidelines may be implemented or not based on each case specific scenario.
Great.
So Melinda, so how open are we to whatever is practicable? That word is, I mean, it seems to me a lot of things could be changed as a result, and that could be interpreted, you know, pretty loosely. So that's why that's an interesting phrase.
Can I make a comment on that, actually, Melinda? Because I think that the City Hall examples with City Hall, it wasn't practicable. But let's say, for example, that it wasn't a grocery store or somebody else coming in, but a development that had 3 or 4 different, was a full block and had 4 different street frontages and wanted no entrances on any of them except for one. Well, that's a gross violation of our our intent, and we could say to the Planning Commission as a staff, this is really to let us as a staff rely on something when we're making a suggestion, like it's not appropriate to allow them to do this with no entrances whatsoever on 3 blocks, because there's no practical reason that they need that, other than that they just don't like the idea, or they don't want the design to be that way, or they're going against kind of the purposes of our zone. And so we're recommending against it. We want somewhere to hang our hats, but design guidelines are not intended to be, they'd be called design standards as opposed to design guidelines if they were meant to be applied and checked off every single time. So we needed something that we could rely on when things were grossly mismanaged in a development project, but not absolute requirements. The absolute requirements we wanted left in the code itself in Title 17 without the design guidelines. So now the standard that Melinda quoted, 75, one entrance every 75 feet, you're supposed to still average entrances every 75 feet, unless you have some specific reason that you're citing that it can't be done, security concerns, et cetera. And that's all written into code. It doesn't need to be part of the design guidelines because we have code for it. So that's kind of the balance in there, I think.
Okay, so it goes both ways then.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Another thing too, to answer that question is that depends on, you know, what the DRC committee feels like as far as, is that element of the design guidelines being met? Is the overall project purpose or the overall MCCD ordinance purpose being accomplished by the project? So they do have some flexibility with that as they see fit, and again, as each project would come forward.
Yeah, if I might, I think we need to have an open house, public comment of some type, one or however many we feel necessary. Earlier the better, so as this is designed, the public can have their input on it, and maybe it can affect the design, maybe it can't. It just depends on what it is. But I think the more public input we have earlier on in the project, the better the public can feel about it, and the better the project will be. It's kind of late once it's designed to say, oh, shoot, we should have done this. Somebody had a good idea. So I think we need to, I know they're open to it. I think we need to do that as soon as we can in the design phase, so something may not be overlooked.
I totally agree on that.
Yeah,
I do too. I think it's really important that we have citizen buy-in. So
Will say I do appreciate this conversation being had, and sorry if I'm nitpicking. I just want to make sure I know where to reference this when I am talking to constituents. But just going over these steps and the process is a good start. But I do agree with Dale that we need to have the buy-in happen as soon as possible. And however that looks, I mean, I know it's, you know, one word versus another, but we really have control of how we can bring the public in. And I think we have an advantage on how we do that too. And that's something to think about.
Yeah, I have had some preliminary discussions with the Evelyn team, and they are open to, even though again, it's not required by our process apart from the Planning Commission public hearings, but they are open and willing to have some type of an engagement process. And we've agreed as well that earlier on, the better. The last thing we would want to do is have some comments or some issues come forward that would cause them to spend a lot of money in redesign of the project. So we've discussed having, you know, some type of a process scheduled once they get through really kind of the site plan and more refined concept than they have right now. So before, like, all of the design level, like, schematics are produced, but a more refined concept than what was presented to the board in November. Really great thing about Evelyn is they have a lot of experience with the public involvement process. So they feel like this is something that they could do internally with their own team. Obviously, with the pandemic going on, we may have to have some kind of creative comment period through electronic means or Zoom meetings or something like that. But that's something that they're willing to do, and something that as we move forward with them in the near future here, we'll get more refinement on timing and concepts. And that would be a really great opportunity, not only for the public to comment, but for the RDA board members, for you all to comment as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. But like I said, earlier the better, so we don't get too far down this too far along with this project before we do have that.
Jared, do you want to just address real quick, because you mentioned something a minute ago about the design guidelines versus kind of like development standards?
Yeah.
You maybe want to just address that real quickly.
Sure. It's a good point. That distinction is that there are a lot of cities that do design guidelines and actually have a separate document that's development standards as well. We elected, rather than, and in that case, you have a really simple zoning code that just outlines uses, et cetera, and then the design of buildings and all of the improvements and everything is contained in those design guidelines and development standards. We elected to do, because of the format of the ordinance as it existed before in November in 2019, we elected to do design guidelines, but to have the development standards just contained within the ordinance itself. So we don't have development standards as a separate document like we do design guidelines, just the stuff that's contained in the ordinance in 17170. So you're going to find a lot of those standards there. And that's where you see things like the hard numbers, the 100 units per acre, and all buildings, 50% of all building frontages within 12 to 18 feet of the back of the curb and gutter, et cetera. Those kind of hard standards that are measurables, quantifiable things, height standards, the 135 feet and the various height standards that we have. Those are just contained in the ordinance instead of in a document, a separate document like design guidelines or development standards. So that's really kind of how that's laid out.
Okay, so unless anyone has any more questions right now on the design guidelines, I think our next slide is on parking. So we'll move to that. And I did want to convey a little bit of information to the RDA board. This is something that's been consistently mentioned, not only with the RDA, but with the city council. And so I wanted to shed some light on some of the parking issues, specifically over in the Fire Clay area as we see them. And I apologize because I wasn't able to put a finger on like the exact language in a development agreement that led to these things. But if you'll walk back with me in time to last year when we took to the city council the memorandum of understanding with Kimball Development on the Kmart site. That MOU was guided by phasing and timing. And one of the things that and I specifically remember Jared saying this, is that we're requiring that the parking structure be constructed up front. And parking structures are something that are very expensive for developers to build. So it's something that you want to require up front that they build and construct. Otherwise, you run the risk of never having that happen. So going back to Fire Clay in 2009, there was a development agreement that was approved by the RDA board for the Fire Clay Investment Partners. The project had 3 phases, and the third phase, unfortunately, was the parking structure. So a lot of the parking issues that were created over in Fire Clay really were a subset of poor phasing on that RDA development agreement. So the developer built the first 2 phases, and the third phase also involved the property that was factory that still exists over there. So another issue with that was just that the third phase in the parking structure was completely founded on acquiring property that really the developer had no way to ensure they acquired. So between that, the property was never able to be acquired, and the developer essentially ended up walking away. And so over in Fire Clay, we have an entire parking structure that was never built. And so that's a lesson that, was learned by the city however long ago, 12 years ago. a mistake that we definitely wouldn't want to make again, and something that we've learned from. So, anything that would be brought to the RDA board or the city council would have that parking structure, that parking required up front. So just one element as to why there was the parking issues that were created over in Fireclay. And what I have not been able to put my finger on is that there's discussion or rumors that have said that previously at some point the development discussions or agreement allowed the developer to include on-street parking as part of their parking totals. We're researching that, and I haven't been able to find that. If that were to be true, that's something that our ordinance wouldn't allow for right now. So I just wanted to give a little bit of perspective on issues that were created in the Fireclay RDA area that, based on those lessons learned, and I just think that we're, always working smarter and better than we were previously. Those are mistakes that wouldn't be made again with this project. So with that, Jared, if you want to just go over the parking as it is on the books right now.
Sure, I can do that. Thanks, Melinda. Just really quickly, this slide shows it's a slide from 2019 when the change was being made. So the new maximum parkings are slightly higher, like you're seeing in that right-hand column, 1.5 and 2. And as you see at the bottom, we also made this change. Parking, allowed parking can exceed those maximums in this zone, as long as it's happening within the building envelope or in parking structures. So if we're not having to look at your extra parking as a parking lot that's taking up space, that ought to be something better than that. Great, then you can do additional parking. But otherwise, we'll allow you to go up to 1.5 spaces for 2 bedrooms or less, and 2 spaces for more than 2 bedrooms, or even more than that, as long as you put it in structures. To give a little context to that conversation, or a little more substance to that conversation Melinda was just having with you, parking structures are no laughing matter. At a minimum of about $20,000 per parking stall to build them. You don't want to count on just goodwill to get those done. You get those done up front if they're going to happen, and there's a serious commitment on the part of a developer as well. So they've got to mean it if they want to exceed those parking spaces, exceed those maximums. But we've seen most developers coming in want to at least do. We haven't seen anybody wanting to go below our minimums. We don't require a lot because this is a high density, very urban intended environment. So the minimums right now are 1-to-1 for residential units of 1 bedroom, and then going up to the 1.5 for 2 bedrooms. To Melinda's point as well, the non-residential space does have a requirement. It's not very heavy, 1 to 500, but we get asked by people all the time, well, hey, I'm going to have, I'm designing this project and I haven't really, they'll design it and their first blush almost always doesn't include any easy access for commercial parking behind the building or near the building or whatever. And they're like, well, I've got the parking out front. Well, that's great. We want you to have that on-street parking, but it doesn't count in your parking calculations. When we figure out how much parking you're required to have based on your square footage, you got to provide that somewhere other than the street. That's never part of the code. It might have been part of a development agreement or something in Fireclay, but it was never part of code, and it certainly isn't in the downtown in the MCCD. They'll have to provide that 1 to 500, which isn't a lot, but it's got to be provided outside of where the on-street parking might be. The on-street parking is just gravy for a project.
Jared?
Yeah.
If I could just interrupt, I'd say never. That was actually part of the code.
Oh, really?
And that was built and was changed. The ordinance was changed. I'm guessing 2015, 2016.
In the Fireclay TOD?
Yeah.
Okay.
So whether that was done by an agreement code until about 20, I don't know, maybe you can remember, GL, when it was, but regardless of when it was changed, it was allowed when Fireclay was built.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. So yeah, and the MCCD that we're looking at here, we don't count it. So yeah. Anything else about any questions about parking other than that? that we want to talk about? Okay.
I have a question. Are there any other cities that are you guys following lead on other cities that have done this or who have been successful at it? Because I know there's a lot of development going on and parking just seems to be an issue. And this is why we keep bringing it up, is because it's been an issue in other cities. And we know we have Fireclay as an example, but we just want to prevent it being a problem.
Yeah.
And maybe talk a little bit about why it was decided to do the MOU with the Kmart property a little bit more.
Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit. To the first part of your question, the other cities that are dealing with the same kind of issues with higher density development around transit stations and in their downtowns and things, these are pretty typical parking requirements. 1.25 to 1.85 spaces per unit. That's pretty typical. I don't have a giant matrix of everybody and what they're requiring, but
are other cities using MOUs too?
Well, they're using development agreements sometimes, and sometimes using MOUs or development agreements of some kind are fairly common in terms of trying to control the phasing of a development, especially a mixed use when you worry about getting things like the parking structure, the commercial development to happen, instead of just getting the residential component up and then having the developer walk away before they're done with their commercial stuff. It's very, very typical. Good tool. That's a good question. In terms of the parking in Fireclay, where we had the issue on the west side of the tracks in the large apartments there that don't really have a lot of commercial with them, and some of the parking problems there, we haven't seen as much of that duplicated on the east side in the newer projects, and they're built to this standard like this with 1.25 or so. It's a very similar standard for parking. We haven't seen the problems. There are fewer parking needs in those projects. They have much smaller units and not as many bedrooms, et cetera, and they're close to the tracks. So the people taking those apartments make conscious choices about how much parking they have available and seem to adhere. So, but yeah, it's in line with what other people are doing, and you see a lot of development. I don't know that they're all using memorandums of understanding. That's kind of a little lesser used than just straight up development agreements, but it's how we went. So, but same difference. Basically, it's the city agreeing with the developer as a part of the code, how they're going to handle the phasing and when they're going to build what. So,
would that be something that we consider with this project, or is it something? No.
Yeah, we could. I don't think it would be dictated by the code based on the project as I've seen it so far, but so far we haven't seen a lot yet. We use memorandums of understanding, like with Kmart. It kicks in two different situations with mixed use developments for us by code. When the project is 5 acres or more, which I don't think this particular 4800 block one is more than 5 acres, is it? It's 3 or something like that. So if the project's 5 acres or more, there's an automatic requirement for a master site plan and an MOU. Or if the project has horizontal mixed use elements, or in other words, if there are commercial components that are required that aren't located underneath the residential component. So what I've seen so far for what they're proposing has been vertical mixed use, which doesn't trigger the MOU and the master site plan either. That's not to say that we couldn't do it as the property owner or want to adhere to it as a city, but that would be a conscious decision you'd have to make outside of the code, I think, because the code's not going to necessarily require it here, the MOU.
Thank you, Jared.
Sure. And again, I'm saying all that without having seen an actual project. We're only seeing concepts and things like that. I haven't reviewed anything, but based on what I've seen so far, I don't expect it to kick in necessarily.
Yeah, the entire block is about 4 acres.
Yeah.
So the requirement of an MOU would not be triggered in this instance. So interesting. I did receive some information, a little bit more information on the Fireclay parking and some of the approvals that was included with on-street parking, which I won't take the time to share that screen, but maybe I'll just send that to the RDA board. That kind of that third phase that never happened, and then there was 834 parking spots that were approved, and it looks like, 170 of those were on-street parking. So, that's definitely, I think, a big contributor to the issues over there. And thankfully a lesson that we've learned from and won't commit to making that mistake again. If we're okay to move on from parking, my last slide is kind of just wanted to go over real briefly with the board the timeline of what we expect from here on out. And then we've done a lot of kind of talking to you. And so I'll turn the time over for you to ask more questions or for the board to have a discussion based on some of the information that we presented today. But in speaking with Edelin, they've looking at where we're at right now, and what they have based their timing on is a 2-year construction. And the one thing that they want to avoid is having a winter opening. And so as we discussed the schedule, they essentially said, well, instead of, basically the way it shakes out would lead to kind of a December 2023, January 2024 opening, which they just didn't want to work through. It's a very difficult time to get leases signed with the holidays, and so they have targeted spring of 2024 to open with a 2-year construction that backs into construction starting the spring of 2022. And then that would essentially give us, as the DRC, the Planning Commission, staff, and the RDA, to get all of our documents and agreements and everything, all the approvals put into place through the end of this year. So I will stop sharing my screen now and just kind of turn the time over to the RDA board for any additional questions or for you all to have discussion based on what we've presented today.
Okay, thank you, Melinda. Does anyone have any questions about the presentation? Okay, thank you. I think we went through the process fairly well. I think there's going to be, I think it's an exciting time. And I think the developers, Brett and I have had an opportunity, more so than the rest of you, to interact with these developers, and I was very impressed with them. That's one of the reasons they were picked. They were upfront, they were honest, they worked hard and to get the business, and I am excited to see how it goes forward. There again, I can't emphasize enough that I believe we need public input on this in the early stages, so when we finish, everybody has a project that they're proud of. With that, does anybody else have anything else, or we'll move on with the agenda?
Dale, just another comment. I think that it's a really good idea to involve the citizens in the process as soon as possible. I'm also wondering, it sounds like it's going to be all small, medium rental units, and I'm just wondering if there's any way we can work diversity into it. It sounds like we really don't have any say in that area. Is that true, Melinda?
Yeah, that's dictated by the market. I mean, we're happy to have conversations with them about that, but essentially, any developer is going to do a market study, and they're going to want to try and hit what that market study comes back with pretty closely, so that they don't end up with a bunch of units that that they can't rent. I seem to recall in recent conversations something about being asked to include, a few 3-bedroom units, and maybe that was even at Murray Crossing, but those were some of the more difficult units for them to lease. So it's it's a dialogue that we can definitely have, but in the end, pro forma and their finances that really should dictate the size of the units and the number of bedrooms.
And whether they're owner, renter, or renter, or whether they're, what prices they are. I mean, if they're middle income or, it sounds like they're going to kind of be high income. I just have concerns about that, and I think our citizens will too, from everything I've been hearing. So I wish
Would you put that conversation on your docket to have with them so we can get an answer for that, Melinda?
Yeah, and I believe there's also regulations with the Fair Housing Act that would prohibit us from regulating some of those things, but we can get more information to you on that.
Thank you.
I just wish there were more diversity in it. It just seems to be, all one standard. And I wish it were more flexible. And I'm wondering if there's any way we can make it may not be the word, but have it be considered.
So let me dig a little bit deeper into your comment about not a lot of diversity. Do you mean the size of units they proposed, or are you speaking more to the income level?
I'm speaking to that. I'm also speaking to whether it's ownership or all rentals, whether it could be a mix of those things. I mean, everything that I have learned and studied says that a mix is the best way to go, especially in those areas. And I'm wondering if we can't have more of a mix, if there's some way we can do that rather than just having it all be expensive apartments that they're going to end up requiring, several people to be able to afford them, if you know what I mean. I mean, if you understand. And that also speaks again to the parking. That's my concern, and I think that's going to be a lot of our citizens' concern. That's what I keep hearing. So,
okay.
Anyway.
Thanks for going a little bit deeper on answering that. So that's definitely a conversation, a concern to pass along to Edelin, and passing that along earlier versus later and waiting until we get to that public involvement portion. I'm happy to do that. I did have just one other piece of information that
real quick, Melissa, I just want to add on real quick. I just would be surprised if Edelin, they seem so, what Diane just said, they seem so what's the word I want to say, so favorable to that when we were talking to them. So I'd be didn't you feel that, Melinda? They seem to be pretty on board on a lot of things like that. So anyway, it was a great question.
I think they want to be sensitive to the concerns that are expressed. But I think they're also, they've been doing this long enough to know too that they're realists, and there are some things that, the public may have an opinion and express input on, but something that may not be able to be included for one reason or another. But they're willing to have those discussions. Brooke had sent some information through the chat that I just thought was worth passing along, and it relates back to a question, Board Member Dominguez, that you asked about the RFP process. And through the state RFP software, whatever the state system, 259 vendors total were notified through that system, in addition to about the 100 or so that I had notified on my own. So some of those could be crossover, but that just gives you a good idea of how many we were able to hit. So I think that's, we did a great, and coming up with 5, I was, when we put this, you'll recall, when we put this RFP out, COVID had just hit. And I was really concerned about getting any responses at all. And And so the fact that we came back with really 5 proposals that I think, you know, any of those proposals would have been viable, I think was a really, to me, that shows that the changes that we made to the ordinance that, you know, to help straightforward, and then also just the desirability of having property owned on 48th and State Street is definitely an area that is, you know, in high demand, especially when we take into account the changes that we're putting in place too with the city hall being constructed. So I think that was a huge thing that we were able to get 5 proposals back.
Dale, can I make one more comment?
Absolutely.
I guess the idea of it just being market driven really grates at me, because it seems so cold, and I think we need to have other considerations. You know, we're dealing with where we're taking our city, and so I think it needs to be more than market driven. So again, I support Dale's saying that we need to include the community, and we need to do it as soon as possible. So thank you. I'm done.
Can I jump in for a sec?
You bet, Kat.
So I just wanted to say I'm grateful that everyone seems on the same page as far as the sooner the public input, the better. And I think that that's really important. And as far as the types of units, any information at all you can give us, you know, when you come back, as far as, you know, if it can be something different. Sorry. I'm distracted now. Stop. Okay. If it, she hears my voice and she assumes I'm talking to her, so she's very excited. Is it like, as far as rental versus owned, or can a certain percentage be, you know, affordable housing? Of if that isn't the case, of the why, and whether it's in code or whether it's because it's out of our purview. But the more information we have helps us, I think, communicate to our residents of the direction we're going and why. So I'm really grateful for any, you know, further clarifications, and like Rosalba pointed out earlier, the where to find it, so that we can help explain it as clearly as possible, because it can be confusing even on the inside of, I know we made the decision because, you know, of these reasons, but then trying to backtrack is confusing. So this was really helpful. Thank you for this whole sort of review of the process. It was helpful to see it clearly laid out. And then my question from there is, when's the next time it comes before us for any type of vote? What's the next step, the next time it's before us, and what type of decision is that as far as sort of the solidity of the project at that point?
Well, let me kind of address the first half of your comments first, and then I'll answer that question. But one of the reasons why in the end we selected Edlin Company over the other developer is based on the TIF ask that was involved. The developer that we did not end up selecting was asking for pretty much all of the increment that would be generated on the site, and even some in addition, above and beyond what the project would generate. And Edlin was not, based on the proposal that they put in, they did not ask for any increment assistance. So I think going back to some of these other questions of, you know, could it be a more diverse product? Could it have some affordable housing elements in there? I think the answer to that is yes. But my guess is that in return, then the ask or the request for TIF would come along with that. And that's something that obviously is a board that's, you know, that is, in the most basic sense, the entire reason why we have RDA project areas is to help get projects completed that would not be able to be completed on their own but also just a caveat of the RDA has done a tremendous amount of work over the last 10 years, assembling all of the parcels and bringing that to market. And that's something that more than likely a private developer wouldn't have been able to do. So, so there's been a lot of work that's already been put in place to bring this product. So, so we can have discussions about some of these other options, and but my sense is again that would come back then with a request for increment, and that would be your trade-off. If you included that don't really make sense with what the market sees out there, then you have to be willing to subsidize them or provide some type of an incentive for the developer to bring that forward as a product. And then Board Member Martinez, to answer your question about when would the RDA board see this again, essentially we're planning on following the process as it's outlined in the MCCD ordinance. And so as a project, you know, the time for the board to submit comments would be whenever we have that public meeting or the public process that Edlands has agreed to do. As far as the project, now in the end, we will be bringing forward several items to the RDA board for consideration, and those will be kind of paced throughout the years as we get to them. I do have a schedule of events that I've received from Edlin, and we need to go over those. I just got those. We need to go over them with the attorney and with the mayor's office and make sure that we're good with what they proposed. Once we've fleshed out the dates with that, we'll send that to the board. But what I would anticipate from here forward is that there will be probably 2 or 3 different agreements that we may bring to the board. One would be for the sale of the property. And if, you know, if Edlin came back with a project that incorporated everything that, you know, that we feel like we had asked for, and for the, you know, everything meets what's required by code and they didn't need any TIF funding, in theory, that would be the only agreement that we would need to bring to the RDA board, would be to sell the property to them. If there is going to be any type of TIF funding that gets dispersed to them, then we would have to bring forward a participation and development agreement for the RDA board to approve. And so there's kind of everything between a purchase and sale agreement and a full-fledged development agreement that may come back to the board for approval. And you know, I would think the soonest that we would be bringing something like that back to the board would be June or July. But my guess is that it would be later on this year, probably more late summer, fall time.
Okay, Dale, can I ask a question?
You bet.
So thank you, Melinda. So Melinda, let me make sure, and I'll keep it brief. So if what Diane had said and what I had mentioned with Diane about that, if it's not market driven, that, thank you, by the way, it kind of started to jive a little more. But if that's not market driven, but it was something we'd really like to see that, and they're saying, well, yeah, if you want to see that, then you have to ante up and through TIF or whatever, and then that's going to be on the city, which is our residents, tap money coming from our residents. Am I correct on that?
Well,
when I say TIF, I'm saying, you know, in general, of course it comes out in different areas, but in general, that comes from us.
So in the end, yes, because it's all dollars that are generated by property taxes. But the beauty and the benefit of project areas is that isn't something that gets reimbursed or delivered back to a developer unless they perform on the development agreement. And so as an example, if we were to say, okay, we want to have a portion of these units be affordable housing. And the trade-off was then they said, okay, we would need to have, let's just say $5 million of TIF to make that happen. Then we go forward, we would bring a development agreement to the board, similar to what we just approved in last July, I think it was, with the ore sampling mill. You would get reimbursed that $5 million over time as you perform what we're requiring you to perform. So that would mean that affordable housing units be made available for the next 20 years. And we would require then that we wouldn't reimburse them a certain amount until their project was constructed, completed, and they were paying their property taxes. And what they would pay in those property taxes is what we would use to reimburse them for the extra benefit that we requested them to bring that wasn't the market rate of the affordable housing. I don't know if I explained it very well.
Yeah. And Eland had presented to take none of that, zero amount, and others a lot more, and that's part of the decision.
Yeah. I mean, the other, proposal really was wanting
Millions?
to have, essentially, I think it was even above and beyond what their project would have generated over the remainder of the lifespan of the project area. And that's another thing to consider too, is that we're only really allowed to capture the additional increment off of those projects until the project area expires in 2034. And so the longer this property sits and doesn't get developed, the less opportunity we would have to provide those additional incentives. But again, as the project was presented from Eland, without including the DAR property as they presented to us, they weren't asking for any assistance.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you.
I have a follow-up question to the market. So how is it determined and how do they go about finding that information? And at what point in the project do they determine that? Is that towards the end? Is it in the middle?
So they would have, even before they, not before, but even while they looked at responding to the proposal, they would have conducted some type of a very basic market study. I would assume that they would do that. Most developers would. So there's a variety of firms that engage in those type of services, and who they used or who others might use, I don't know, but that would have been, if you will recall from the proposal that we did send out to the board that was included in your November packet, part of what was required in the proposal was a financial statement or their pro forma. Now, we did have to redact some of that information as it was considered privileged, but that pro forma, or what they brought forward, would have been based on a very preliminary market study. So they would have been able to go in and do the math that would say, okay, here's how our business model works. Here's what the market is saying would be available or would be marketable for this type of the zone and the density. And they work their magic and they come back with this proposal that says, okay, based on our market data and research that we have, and B, our business model and financing, this is what we can propose with our project, and we know it'll work out for us.
but they can go back and see and change that if they need to, or if the economy, I mean, there's predictions that we're may go into a recession, and that can change the whole market driven, and it can change their project essentially, right? I mean, at whatever extent they want to change it.
Yeah, it could. And again, as an example, I mean, it's outside of an RDA project area, but earlier, I keep on saying, okay, early last year, transitioning from 2020 to 21, early last year, we had a project that was approved, the Bonneview site. And initially they had, Jared could say the numbers, but initially they had their project approved with, I think it was about 270 units or so.
Sounds right. Yeah.
They went through their process. They realized that to make it pencil out, they needed to add additional units. And so last fall, I think it was in November, they amended conditional use permit and increased their density to 350 units. So there is a mechanism for a project to morph based on, I guess, additional information. But my guess is that Edlin, would be nimble enough with and experienced enough that they would be able to really address that up front and not have to go back through an approval process. But if they did need to, that's what would happen. There's always amendments to agreements, and that's one of the things that has been so confusing and kind of trying to unwind and untangle with all of the agreements over in Fireclay is that some of them have 5 and 6 amendments, and so there could potentially be an opportunity for a project once it's granted approvals either through the Planning Commission or with the RDA board to have changes made to it, but not without going back through an official approval process.
So in this case, it would go back to the DRC, then the Planning Commission, and depending on what it is, maybe even us. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand that process.
Yeah.
And then I don't know, I have a few questions. Do you have any other follow-ups? Can I ask a few questions, Dale?
No, you bet.
Okay. So one of the biggest concerns, and I know we've talked about public input, and I do appreciate that Elin is willing to do that, but citizens, especially in my district, they feel like they're being unheard. So if we do, and this is, I think, just for the RDA in general, what are the steps after citizen comments do we take to follow up with citizens? If we can just highlight that, and is it something that we as a board and our district should follow up with them independently? Does the staff do that? What's the process in that?
So again, you asked some really excellent questions, and I'm glad we're having this conversation. So one, we're always, and this goes for any of the board members too, we're always here to answer questions. If you guys have questions about a process or a project or something that's coming before the DRC or Planning Commission, please feel free to reach out. That definitely goes to citizens as well. We do spend a lot of time on the phone with phone calls. Last year we sent out over 6,000 public notices, and so that generates a lot of calls and questions, and we're very happy to answer those. Appreciate it when residents come to us directly so we can make sure that we get them accurate information and let them know how a process works precisely versus maybe some of the dialogue that might take place that would lead to information that isn't accurate as we could give out. So that being said, unfortunately, a lot of times public comments are given on items that the law really has determined to be public clamor. And I can see a smile on maybe the face of one of the attorneys as I said that, but there oftentimes, unfortunately, a lot of the public comments that we that we get aren't items that can be addressed based on the ordinances and the regulations that we have put in place. So, you know, it's very hard, and that's where, unfortunately, as city council members, RDA board members, and even as staff, we have to kind of be able to navigate and take some of those comments and help then turn around and help a resident understand that while they may, and as an example, while they may feel like a development is going to negatively impact their neighborhood, let's say with traffic, we have technical staff, which is the reason why we had Danny Astle and Trey Stokes, our city engineer, included on the RFP review committee, so that they can look at that technical data. Trey understands traffic studies. He looks at those all the times, and he can understand exactly how a neighborhood's going to be impacted and whether that impact would be enough to deny a development. Not really the way the land use works. It's how then would we mitigate that impact versus denying a project. I'm not sure I'm really answering your question very well, but
I think that's helpful. I think just in, you know, even if it's off topic, if there is a response to a citizen that has comments, and it was more specifically with the RDA and maybe because of the said topic, but just what the follow-up is. I guess I just really wanted to understand how, if there is follow-up, even if it's off topic or not on the agenda, how that gets addressed. So that was just one concern, but yeah, I mean, that helps me understand. I think it's just, there's a feeling of disconnect is what I'm gathering, is all it is. It's just a feeling of disconnect. And you kind of touched on what a follow-up question I was gonna ask is, what goes into approving these projects in terms of studies, whether it's, and this is just more because I'm new, I'm trying to understand how this process will work and what an applicant is required to do. When they come forward, what traffic studies are they required to do? Are there traffic studies? Is there an environmental study? That was a question that I kept getting asked. I'm like, let me find out. And also, how does this affect infrastructure? And I know Trey and Danny kind of look into this in terms of infrastructure. And does that come in with, you know, taxes from those residents that we gather? And how do we look at adding additional police and fire? And I know that's a big concern right now that I keep hearing from residents. So, and with this project and other projects moving forward.
Okay. So again, really great questions, and we're always happy to help anyone understand the answers to these questions. So let me go back to the first part of your question, which you asked about studies. So that depends. If you would recall, and maybe actually this dialogue was taking place, I think, probably right around the time of the elections and maybe before you were on the council, but we did embark on having a very limited traffic study done of the 48th and State Street property, neighborhood circulation plan. And we included that information in the proposal, and that way developers would have a really good taste of what would be required for the project, and as far as impacts that may come to the area based on that. The more pointed answer to that question is that again, Trey has the ability to require a traffic study on any project that he would feel like it would be warranted. And then there's a tipping point in our ordinance that says any development that brings over, is it 50 residential units, Jared, into, or is it 30 or 40? I don't know.
It's 30, I want to say it's 30 lots or 100 resident or 100 multifamily units, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
That's around there.
That sounds more
right.
and probably more to the point is why I can't really recall, because it's kind of both.
Yeah.
So there is a certain point where there is a traffic study that would be required. As far as environmental studies, that's something that usually is required through kind of a mortgage or a financing process, is that the property, before you would buy a property, you would need to have some type of an environmental study done. We have done a phase 1 and a phase 2 on the entire block of property, including the DAR property that we owned, and we've done that through the Brownfields grant. And so we have those studies completed, and we are in the process now of taking another step to get more core samples drilled, and so to be able to come up with a cost analysis for, there is some very limited contamination on the site. I think there previously have been like a dry cleaner and or a fueling station, and so environmental studies, yes, that would be required. But let me go, if you're speaking about that the federal government requires, which that's traditionally termed as an environmental study. No, in this instance, we would not be doing any type of a NEPA study. And then to go next to your question about infrastructure, we do know that there is some public infrastructure that will be impacted by this project. We know there's power lines that'll need to be relocated, and we've already had some dialogue and discussions with the power department on trying to get some costs on what those relocations would be. And I don't think there's any issues as far as water, and I don't think there's any sewer issues. Storm drain would have to be addressed through the project, and that's also part of development costs, that they would be required if there was a water line that had to be extended or expanded. Typically, the development would pay for those costs. And then another thing too is impact fees. And the city does have in place impact fees for sewer, power, I believe, stormwater, and for water. And those impact fees should be used to help pay for any new growth that would need to be developed with those services in order to pay for the new growth. So as an example, if you had a subdivision that was going to require that the city increase its water service, those impact fees that have been collected over the period of time could be used to drill a new well to get the water service increased. So that's some of the ways that impact to services are paid for by development. Primarily, it's the developer that shoulders the responsibility for those additional infrastructure needs and services that would have to be brought in. Not something that really Murray has seen very much over the last, well, many years because of the phase of development that we're in, right? But like younger cities like Harriman, that's happening all the time where, people are developing land and a sewer line doesn't exist out there. And so the impact fees can pay for the sewer line extension to that new area that's being developed. But that would also, be the case with infill development. Those impact fees should be able to account for that. And then to speak with, police and fire, we don't have any impact fees for police and fire. Some cities do, but we don't. And so that would just have to be addressed, through a regular process of the working with the police chief and the mayor and the city council as a budget was set and as staffing needs were determined.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then lastly, there were some questions about just the facade and whatnot, but I'm assuming those questions could be addressed directly to the DRC when it's up in that phase. Is that correct? Okay, perfect. I just wanted to make sure to get clarification on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so the
Thank you
DRC, the DRC though doesn't take public comment.
So, but within the Planning Commission, I'm assuming.
Yeah, and then through that, when we determine to hold kind of that concept level public involvement period.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And that's pretty much my questions were in regards to this process. So, and you went over quite a bit. So thank you. I appreciate that. I think we lost Dale.
Are there any other questions? Are there any other questions?
Not for me.
All right, I got kicked out for a second. I was panicking. Project updates, Melinda.
Okay, well, one of the things that the RDA chair and vice chair asked was for us to provide a kind of a written update with our projects. And we've had several meetings as of late where we've kind of had to skip the project update section. So I think that'll be a good practice going forward, is to just have a brief written project update for you all that we'll include in the packet. So I briefly gave you an update on the cell phone tower relocation. Finally, that's underway. We anticipate the construction will take between 8 and 12 weeks, which puts us really kind of the end of March. So also, I let you know that the 42 South road construction final costs came in, and the Public Works Department did a really great job of keeping the budget down with that project. So we have, they should maybe have already received their check, but we've reimbursed the developer the remainder of their 2017 TIF payment, which was just over $75,000. So hopefully that'll help them construct that parking lot that they have approved over there and get some more relief for the parking issues over there. That parking lot should bring about 50 more parking spaces to the area. We did receive the dates on the 48th South State Street exclusive negotiation agreement from Eadlin last week. We just need to sit down and go over those with GL and with the mayor's office. And once we have those finalized, we'll be sending that back to Eadlin for signatures. And then when that's executed, we'll send out an agreement, the final agreement, to the board, so you can see that. Jesse Knight Legacy Center, they're still continuing to work with the state DEQ to refine exactly what they need to do with the cleanup process for that site. Think Architecture, we also have completed a phase 1 and 2 on that property through the Brownfields grant. They'll start working on a cost assessment soon, and based on what that comes back at, we'll determine next steps with Think Architecture. But working through the Brownfields grant is great because those assessments are paid for. by the federal dollars and not out of pocket by the city or by the developer, but it does take a lot longer to work through that process. So we had anticipated some of those answers we would get back last summer, but here we are in January, still waiting for some of those processes to be complete. So, but that's still very much on our radar, and hopefully we'll get answers back on that in March, and then be bringing forward some final steps with that development to you early summer. And then also we received initial disbursement of our 2020 tax year payments from the county in December. And so we'll be working with Brenda and with Zion to get the final payment amounts determined and start working to process the TIF payments that we'll need to make for the Fire Clay area. And that is it, unless there's any questions.
Anybody have any questions for Melinda? Doesn't look like it. We'll adjourn the meeting, and I think, are we starting on time, Diane, for meeting of the whole?
Yeah, 5:15. So we'll have to go out of this meeting and then go into the other. So,
Okay.
That's right. So we're signing out of here then.
yeah, we're signing out, and then we'll sign into the other one. So you've got about 9 minutes.
Okay.
See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Melinda.
Thank you. Thank Melinda. Thanks.
Welcome to the Murray City Municipal Council Committee of the Whole for January 19th, 2021. And all council members are present, so we'll get started. There is a notice that I need to read. It is hereby given that this meeting will occur electronically without an anchor location in accordance with Utah Code 52-4-2074. Due to infectious disease COVID-19 novel coronavirus, the council chair has determined that conducting a meeting with an anchor location presents substantial risk to the health and safety of those who may be present at the anchor location because physical distancing measures may be difficult to maintain in the Murray City Council chambers. Okay, the public may view the meeting via the live stream at www.murraycitylive.com or on Facebook at www.facebook Murray City, Utah. Murray is capitalized. Citizen comments or public hearing comments may be read live, into the record by sending an email in advance or during the meeting to city.council@murray.utah.gov. That's all lowercase. Comments are limited to less than 3 minutes. Include your name and contact information. All right, so let's get started with approval of the minutes for the Committee of the Whole for December 8th, 2020. Do I have a motion?
I'll make motion that we approve the Committee of the Whole minutes from December 8th, 2020.
I'll second.
All right, it has been seconded and we have a motion. So let's see, Brooke, would you call the roll?
Sure. Mr. Hells,
Aye.
Ms. Martinez,
Aye.
Mr. Cox,
Aye.
Ms. Dominguez,
Aye.
and Ms. Turner.
Aye. Thanks, Brooke. Let's continue on to the discussion items. And the first one is the 2020 Moderate Income Housing Report with Melinda Greenwood and Jared Hall. It's good to see you guys again. Seems like we just left.
Well, I'm still trying to catch my breath from the last meeting. So
I know, me too.
Jared prepared the report and I'm going to just let him take it from here.
Let me
Hey,
see.
Jared.
Are you guys seeing the screen that says Moderate Income Housing Report?
Yep.
Yep. Oh, good. Well, great. That might be the only thing that goes well about this. So here we go. This is every year we are now required to as a city file a moderate income housing report with the state of Utah. And this, I'll go over a couple of things that are different about that now than have been in the past. It's been a thing that cities have been doing for a number of years. In recent last couple of years, there have been some changes. And so I wanted to go over some of those and just give you the real rough outline of the report. I know that in the council action form that Melinda sent you all, you got a copy of the actual report. There's a lot of data in there and a lot of things in there, more detailed responses that I'm going to go over in slides here. But if you have any questions about anything that you've seen there, please feel free to just jump in and ask them. I want to be brief and give you time to ask any questions about this report or what the impacts of it are or what it means for the city every year. First off, it is going to be something that we're going to be doing yearly now, annually. It has previously been, I think when it started out back in the late 90s, it was every third year, and then it went to every other year, and cities got together and filed it all in groups, and it's kind of gone lots of different directions. In 2018, they passed SB 34 that said you're going to file it other than this next year in 2019, when we'll give you all a break to come into compliance with some things. Bigger cities are going to be filing it every year. So that's us. We're going to be filing every year by December 1st a report on our moderate income housing element. It includes several things. As you can see there on the slide, it does include an updated projection of the city's 5-year affordable housing needs. And that's based on those 4 things that are listed there. The projected growth of our households, that's our demand. The projected housing stock that we will have, that's our supply. And then the median housing costs and the projected median household incomes for the city. So there's a lot of data that goes into it. And we'll get into where that data comes from in a moment. The report also has to include a review or findings of our moderate income housing element of our city's general plan. And that's in the form of responses to certain questions that they ask us in the form. The report also has to include our most recently adopted copy of our moderate income housing element of the general plan. And then the report has to be posted to the city's website. So we are in full compliance this year, and we will be every year as long as we're able. And a couple of things to note about this. One of the things that SB 34 in 2018 demanded was that cities couldn't have just a moderate income housing plan that was separate from their general plan. SB 34 said you cities have to have a general plan, and that general plan has to have a moderate income housing element that's part of the plan. So we actually already did. But then it did a couple of other things as well, and we'll get into those in just a moment. I mentioned just briefly that the main part of the report is to update the projection of the city's 5-year affordable housing needs. And that's summed up really basically in this table right here that's in the report. So what you're looking at basically is the 2020 shortages at 3 different levels of moderate income, levels of median income for the county, Salt Lake County, and for Murray City. 80% of that median income, 50% and 30%. And according to the data, we have an abundance or an overage of 140 units in that 80% of the moderate income of the median income range, and a deficit of about, a net total of about 2,500 units in the 2 lower categories, in 50% and 30%. So that doesn't, I mean, it's kind of depressing to look at those red numbers, and they look bad maybe, but that's only if you're not looking at the data for the rest of the county and the rest of the state and the rest of the United States of America. Frankly, these are not numbers that are unique to Murray. We have an affordable housing shortage throughout the country, and we actually do pretty well. That we still have a category where we are running a surplus of units is good, because the lines trend downward. So we're all fighting what you have to see as a kind of a losing battle unless some big changes get made. But that's where the numbers shake out. The data that we use to generate these numbers comes from the Census Bureau. They run the American Community Survey, and we can use those numbers to generate these final totals. Next year's an exciting year because it's the actual census number. It's not the interim numbers. It's the good hard numbers that we only get once every 10 years. So it'll be kind of a fun report for all nerds everywhere. So let me move on. We can come back if you have any questions about that. The other part of the report is that we have to review the elements of our moderate income housing plan and our strategies that are contained in that. And I mentioned that there were some other changes from SB 34 back in 2018. And one of those was that they dictated that you had to have a moderate income housing element to your general plan instead of just a separate plan. And that you had to have a certain number of strategies from a menu that they provided. And when I say they, I mean the state of Utah. So there was good news and bad news for us as Murray City. In our element, in our general plan, we already had more than enough strategies. We had 6 or 7 strategies already, and they coincided beautifully with what they were asking for as a state. However, we were missing 2 strategies that we were required to have because we're what's called a transit city. We have transit lines that run through the city and transit stations in the city at the tracks and commuter rail station. So we were required by SB 34 to have those 2 top ones that you see: maintain reduced residential parking requirements around transit stations. Ours is worded a little differently, but basically you had to have reduced residential parking requirements where you had transit stations, and you had to implement transit-oriented development and mixed-use zones for properties around transit stations. We were already doing those things in our zoning, but we didn't state them explicitly in our general plan. So at the end of the year in 2018, we updated or in 2019 rather, we updated our general plan to include those two strategies as well. And the other strategies that we were already promoting were, as you see, following there: to ensure zoning of residential areas wasn't prohibiting compatible types of housing, to promote affordable housing options, to continue supporting accessory dwelling units. That's been a big deal for a lot of cities. A lot of cities that weren't doing anything for moderate income housing elected in 2019 to adopt accessory dwelling units. It seemed like an easy thing to do. We've been doing it as Murray City for a number of years already. So again, we were kind of ahead of the curve in that regard. To support the use of density bonuses and support housing types, et cetera. One of the things we haven't undertaken yet, although it's a strategy and a goal that we've identified, is that final one: to review the zoning ordinances and make any modifications to allowable housing types and lot sizes and setbacks that might limit types of housing in a zone. We haven't really done a comprehensive review and proposed any big changes to the regular zoning codes, but it's something that we could look at. Again, one of the requirements was that it was to be part of the general plan, so we have updated our general plan to include those two other strategies, and all of that's in the report as well. But that's basically the moderate income housing report for the year. We're required to file it every year, and although these numbers, I'm going to go back a couple of slides, even when these numbers for lots of cities, and they're already this way for lots of cities, even if those are negative or deficits in every category for a city, really it's not that you have to show that you're positive in all these categories. It's that you have, the other part of the plan is what's more important, that you illustrate as a city or demonstrate as a city that you are looking at the numbers and that you know that there's an issue or that there are issues that need to be addressed, and that you have a plan that addresses those issues, and then you're actively trying to see those strategies through. So that's really the kicker. And we're able to do all of that successfully. This is tied to our transportation funding. SB 34 ties these reports, filing these reports and demonstrating that you are making a good faith effort, basically, as a city to deal with moderate income housing needs, to your transportation funding that's available. I think Trey was mentioning a couple of weeks ago the project to make improvements at the intersection of College Drive and 53rd South. That came from a transportation fund initiative that might not be available if we cease to file these reports or if we stop concerning ourselves with moderate income housing. So it does matter that we do these things and that we comply with these rules from the state and have a moderate income housing plan that can be effectuated. Do you have any questions for staff at this point about the moderate income housing plan? Right. We can always, we kind of, I thought we had until the end of December like we normally had, but SB 34 also said we're going to file them on December 1st. We can also try to bring them to you before they're getting filed, but the filings actually, the data is the data. We can't really change what it is. So we want to make you aware of it, and so you can see it as a council and know that it's there. And if people in your districts have questions about what the city does for moderate income housing, there's a lot of information in that report. There's a lot of great, interesting numbers. Some of them are a little depressing, but they are really interesting about household size and the trends for household size, median incomes in the county and in Murray, and where they're trending, what those trend lines are. They're all in those tables that are in that report. So when you want something fun to look at someday, point people that direction to the moderate income housing report. It's kind of fun to see. So.
Jared, just to add on, and if you want to stop sharing your screen.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Sure, there you go.
To add on just a couple of things, I did include in the information that we sent to you 2 additional items. One was the study that the Kempsey Gardner Institute put out about the affordable housing, which I thought was interesting for a couple of points. Is they really kind of celebrate and highlight fire clay as a success story, and that's I think sometimes we don't look at it from that standpoint, because we do have some issues over there with parking and some other things. But it's nice to see that others recognize that fire clay really has accomplished some of these purposes that the moderate income and affordable housing plans have set out to solve, and to have the development addressed in those transit-oriented areas. The other thing I included was the article that was put forward in December, which was two things. One, a response to that Kempsey Gardner study, but also it was a summary of that study. And so if you don't want to take the time to read the whole study, don't blame you, because we're not all nerds, like to nerd out on information like me and Jared. But if you read that couple pages of an article, I think it gives a really succinct summary of that study and helps to pinpoint and further explain what the state legislators really are asking us to accomplish by requiring these reports. And as Jared mentioned, you know, we're required to submit this report annually now, but we're not necessarily required to perform. And one thing to point out is that we are a lot better off as far as our numbers and figures than many other communities are. But another thing that I want to follow on that point with is the state legislature and our representatives are bringing forward more requirements all the time for us to address these issues. And when I say us, I don't necessarily mean just Murray City, but for cities in general to address these issues. And I was in a discussion last week with the Redevelopment Association, and we were reviewing some of the proposed bills that will be coming forward through this legislative session. And there is a bill that that is now looking to tie not only our transportation funds, but also economic development funds through GoEd that might be dispersed to our city to ensuring that these affordable housing issues are being addressed by cities. And so just really the point with sharing that information with you is that this is something that really is being, it's a pressure point that's being applied not only to Murray City, but to all cities. There are special requirements and provisions that we have to go through based on the fact that we're a transit city, as Jared mentioned earlier. All of this has been put into state code, and I would expect from here going forward that these requirements are going to become more stringent as time goes forward and as the affordable housing crisis continues to get worse. And so just kind of preparing you for that. And again, if you ever have any questions about the information that we've presented or that we put out to you in a packet, please feel free to reach out. We're happy to try and explain that. This next report that will be due December of 2021 will be a very interesting one because we will have that additional information coming back from the 2020 census. So stay tuned for more nerding out on reporting numbers.
Okay, Melinda, thank you. We're kind of running late, but are there questions at this point for Melinda? Kat?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kat.
Dan read my mind.
No, I saw you move. I thought it was.
My question was, and this is sort of harkening back to our conversation in RDA about the market versus what we can impact in development. How do we practically meet those goals with medium income housing or any type of housing that we have goals for? I mean, I think this is hugely important, but I guess I'm a little confused in how we can best practically meet the goals within our abilities.
Well, that's one of the reasons that the important part of the report is actually the explanation of our strategies and how we're doing on those. One way, for example, is to allow varieties of housing like accessory dwelling units. It does make an impact. They tend to be affordable or more affordable than other types of housing. So anytime you're allowing a diversity of housing, you're typically allowing that to happen. If you read that Kempsey Gardner report too, you're going to find a really pretty succinct even without the article that explains it, a pretty succinct explanation of what the best practices are. And that is to increase, you can't really impact affordability for housing in a market like this unless you increase densities in certain areas. The best way to do that are along tracks lines, which is why we're identified as a transit city with 3 good track stations. We have an ability to put density where it can be best handled that not every city has the ability to do. So for us, that's the way you impact it. It's a regional problem. It's a global problem, really, for the country. You're right. We can only do so much, and that's why it's really sort of an accountability exercise. Are we trying to do the things that we can do to impact? And that's to allow density, to allow diversity of housing types, and to recognize that that has to be done if we're going to have any impact on the affordability. Utah ranked, I'm going to get this wrong, in the top 25 metro areas in the country for lack of affordability, and the top 5 for increase in housing price. It's really difficult right here, right now. You don't have to know that from data. You know that from looking around. All you have to do is visit Zillow to know that's a fact. But it's a problem that is mostly market driven, but we do have some ways that we can impact it. And density is the main one. Allowing mixed uses and densities where they're appropriate is the best thing we can really do.
Okay. Rosalba, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were ready with your question.
No, that's okay. Kat pretty much the same question is, and so the one question I do have, and at some point, are we letting legislation kind of dictate what's going to happen and how we implement housing initiative, and maybe look at code to help with that for future developers? Or is that something that, how do we do that? Or do we build relationships like NeighborWorks to kind of help play into that?
That's a great question, and that's exactly the answer. We build relationships with housing corporations like NeighborWorks, or there's others in the area too, Rocky Mountain Corporation, Rocky Mountain Housing. And we do the things that we were doing before the state legislature said we had to do them. They came up with those requirements for transit cities, and like I mentioned, Murray had already made the decision as a city years before to say we're going to put higher densities around our transit stations and in the core of the city where it can be best handled, and do kind of, for lack of a better way of saying it, our part in the region. Those requirements of SB 34 weren't intended for us because we were already doing it. We added it to our general plan, but zoning was already ahead of that. Those were intended for other cities which shall remain unnamed that hadn't done that yet and then needed to make that change. And they're starting to do their part too. So regionally, I think that's what we do. We double down on that commitment to the places where it can be done most effectively and with the least impact to the other development patterns. There's a lot of times you hear comments about the extinction of single family homes, and that's I get the concern, but when you look at the numbers, it doesn't bear out. 90% of the developed land in the Salt Lake Valley is single family homes. 70% of Murray's land, 90% of the developed residential land is single family homes in the valley. In Murray, 70-something% of our land overall is single family zoning. So adding density to the core or to certain areas isn't going to cause the extinction of single family neighborhoods. It's just adding density where we're able in some leftover spaces. So.
Okay, we've already exhausted our 20 minutes and this is not nearly enough. So I would like to propose that we continue this conversation. I think it's important. I think this report's important. And so I would like to continue it and perhaps schedule some training, including this or a retreat or something that includes this and the general plan and how it all works together. I think it's really important, and I'm not sure that all council members or any council members really understand it. So what do you think about that?
I think a retreat would be awesome to be able to do that in, Diane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
that's important. I think you made a good point by coupling it with the general plan and just understanding it a little bit more.
I think that would be really helpful. So we'll have Jennifer set that up and see what we can do and continue this, because I actually read the whole thing. I'm kind of one of those nerds. I love this stuff. So I think it'd be really good to continue. Okay. All right. If there are no more questions, since we're running out of time, let's go to the next one, which is the general plan and zone map amendments 5283, 5157, 5217, and 5177 South, and 151 East, 5300 South. My goodness, Melinda and Jared, it's you guys again.
Well, I think this discussion and some of the discussions we've had in the past couple of council meetings really kind of relate back to discussion item of number 1, but I'll give an introduction on this, and then again, I'll let Jared do his thing. But this is for the property known as the point at 53rd. So the property there on the northeast corner of 53rd and State Street. And you'll recognize that for those of you who like to shop at Best Buy or eat at Chick-fil-A or Mimi's. The property owner has come to us and has asked for a general plan amendment from general commercial to mixed use, and then a zone map amendment from the commercial development to mixed use as well. So I'll let Jared take it from here.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to share this screen, make sure it's the right one. Can you all see that general plan and zone map amendment? Okay, so as Howland Partners, Howland Partners owns the point at 53rd, and it's about 13.2 acres, those different properties, and they are asking for that general plan amendment and zone map amendment. Just to get into the background of that a little bit, if you want to see this from the air, you can see Costco across the street here and the IMC parking lot, Chick-fil-A on the north, and the park behind 53rd South here. So all of these properties would be involved. There's a significant sort of mid-box, big box presence on the north end of the site that concerns the owners and makes them want to take this step into mixed use. Zoning wise, this is the current zoning. It is CD zoning. You can see the open space zone behind in the park, and here as well, actually, in the park. I don't know why that's not colored green like it should be, but that's open space zoning as well. It is largely CD zoning. Just off of the map, there is some mixed use zoning you can see down here across. This is a future land use map segment. So you're seeing the properties highlighted. They're in the general commercial category. This has all been categorized as professional office, where the IMC campus is, the high school here. A couple of things to note. This is the station platform for Murray Central. So you have the tracks and front runner combining here. This is fairly close to that. There is some walkability through. It's not the greatest pedestrian environment, but that's what the general plan and the mixed use zoning designation would try to correct if that were changed. So it has a good position in terms of staff's view of mixed use zoning because of its proximity to open space. That's important with mixed use. It has a good proximity to a very important transportation corridor of State Street, 53rd South, and good proximity to the transit that's available at Murray Central Station. And it's very close. You can just see to the north here. It's not far from the Murray City Center district zoning, where we expect there to be eventually an expansion of our downtown area. So it's downtown adjacent at the very least. We talked before about some of the differences between mixed use zoning and CD zoning. There are certain differences for height structures, parking differences, building setbacks, etc. The main difference, of course, being that mixed use zoning would allow a significant higher density residential component. In this particular case, they're close enough that it would be 80 units to the acre. in conversations with the property owner, they're not looking at anything that dense, but that's what the zoning would allow, about 80 units per acre. We do have, and I'll be quick because I know we're short on time and I want you to be able to ask questions as you have them. We did have a planning commission public hearing on this matter on December 3rd. There were 42 public notices mailed. We only had one public comment. It was from a gentleman who was very excited about the possible change, hoping to see walkability increased in the area and something more unique than the pattern of development. The Planning Commission did vote 7-0 to recommend the approval based on the findings that you see there. We do feel as staff, and recommended as such to the Planning Commission, that the general plan provides enough support to this change to be made. That the zone map amendment and the general plan amendment to support that would be appropriate under the current general plan and zoning. Do you have any questions for staff at this point?
I do.
Questions?
Yeah. Tell me, I don't even know, can I ask this question? What is Best Buy staying or moving, or what do you know, or what's happening?
Yeah, are they going to tear them down, or how's that?
I would defer it to Melinda. I don't think we know the answer to that question specifically yet. Do we, Melinda?
No, we don't. But the intent would be to convert probably some of the commercial space that they have into residential, but more so to just add on to to add existing stories onto, or excuse me, to add additional stories onto existing stories that are there. One of the things that Gary Howland has communicated when we've met with him on several occasions, which really we started meeting with him probably about a year ago, and he's just said that as he sees the future of retail being sustainable, it just can't be done without having a residential component. And he feels like this site would be a really great look residential component in. So he's really trying to get I would say, in front of some of the changes that may be coming down the line with some of the leases or agreements that he has with the tenants, and trying to be proactive and get the residential in there that diversifies and makes that residential or the retail sustainable.
Other questions?
I do. So one of my questions is, currently, is all his spaces leased right now? Are all his spaces, his retail spaces leased? Because I know he has the spaces above where Best Buy is, correct?
Yeah, I think that was like a unique area that was created that I think any of his tenants can use. Jared, I don't know if you know any more about that, but as far as some of the other
office spaces.
There are some office spaces, and he actually has there are some office spaces, and some of those are occupied. I couldn't say that they're all occupied. I know there are some occupants up there, and there's a small structured parking component to this project already too. It's not nearly large enough to house to handle. They'd need more structured parking to handle a mixed use development. And it would significantly change with a mixed use development component like Melinda's describing. He's not talking about tearing everything down and starting from scratch. It's a successful and active complex. He just wants to add that component. And so you wouldn't be looking at a tear down, no, but a portion of it might. We don't really know. We don't have plans or anything like that.
And what's the height restriction on this area for commercial?
So in commercial, you get 30 feet if you're within 100 feet of residential. There's not any residential nearby enough to affect it. So you get 30 feet and then you get a foot for every 4 feet you're distant. I don't know what his actual height restriction is based on the nearest residential, but it's over 50. It's probably 60, 70, 80 feet tall right now.
Okay.
The same kind of rule would apply, but with a 50-foot baseline for mixed use and then going up 1 to 1.
So currently it's 13 acres, is that correct?
Yeah, just
so
over.
Put up over 1,000 units in that one space.
800 and something would be possible at the 80 units per acre.
80, okay, I just,
Yeah, 'cause
I think it was over 1,000.
Oh, it might be. I haven't done that math recently. It's been off my radar for a little bit.
All right, I was just trying to get
Rose,
that.
over 1,000 what did you say? I'm sorry.
It was
Units?
like 1,000, over 1,000 units, yeah,
Okay.
that they could put in.
Thanks.
I mean, at what's in code now, so, okay.
Yeah, just over.
Those are my questions.
Thank you. And then one thing I neglected to mention, and I just wanted to, if you guys would indulge me 1 second, I was going to share a screen one more time. Can I do that? This is from the Planning Commission's presentation. I know that we've been talking about the general plan, and so I wanted to just show this really briefly. This area too, one of those supports for it is that this area was identified on the general plan for future study and changes as consideration for a BRT station village. When that bus rapid transit line is implemented on State Street, this corner is anticipated to be a station village area under that general plan. And anyway, just to show you that. So anyway, we did feel like the change was appropriate, recommended such to the Planning Commission, and their recommendation to you was positive as well.
Any other questions for Jared?
One last question. I know where City Hall sits, that is considered MCCD and how
Yes.
many units? So let's say that property then gets sold to well, I guess it could be mixed use, right, currently?
It's MCCD, so it could, if we move City Hall to the new location, then that acreage would all be available for development.
How many acres is that?
6 something.
Okay, so I mean, I think this is the right location for this type of use.
Yeah.
So I just want to kind of get a footing over the surrounding and the numbers. So thank you.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. The MCCD, one thing to keep in mind too, this area is just outside the MCCD zone. The MCCD acreage was all included in a public works study and a capital improvements program from before. So that 6 acres of City Hall site that could be redeveloped has already been planned for in terms of public works and facilities. So, and we've identified under the new sewer master plan how to deal with additional units being added to this part of State Street as well. So we should be okay in terms of public services for at least the beginnings of these developments. And then there's going to have to be some upgrades made as additional projects come in.
Yeah, in fact, this project, we received the application for this in September, I think. And based on some concerns from Public Works, we asked the applicant if he wouldn't mind delaying the application until we got numbers back on sewer capacity. So that is something that we go through and we look at when we have these applications come through, is we look about service capacity, infrastructure, if it can take on the new growth. And in this particular case, there was a question. And so the Howlands were gracious enough to let us to delay the application to be heard until we received that information back. So, so this is an application that's been in since September and is finally coming to you now.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Melinda. Thanks, Jared. All right, now we're at number 3, text amendment for residential chicken keeping. Melinda and Jared again.
Well, this is an item that the City Council asked us to review, and I think that request came to us late summer. So we've taken the time to research kind of what the last 5 years or so of chicken keeping and the history of what we have, I guess, addressed in Murray City during the last 5 or so years. And again, I'm just going to let Jared take it from here.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share this screen. And we can talk about residential chickens. There's a number of things to be aware of. Just first, in terms of a timeline, in 2012, there was an increase in code enforcement cases from chickens, and the council asked planning to look at an issue, or to look at the issue. From 2013 to 2015, there were some open houses and a draft ordinance, and there was a positive recommendation from the Planning Commission. But in 2016, the council eventually rejected the chicken ordinance. But in 2020, we were asked, as Melinda said, to look into it again. The proposed, as she mentioned, we did do a survey and there were a number of responses, but I wanted to go over the proposal and then we'll kind of back into the reason that it's been proposed this way because of the survey. This is our proposal, that we would allow chickens because the overwhelming response on the survey was that people in the city appear to want the residential allowance for keeping chickens. So on anything less than 6,000 square foot lots, and we have a few that are less than that, we would allow a maximum of 4 chickens. And this is assuming, again, that we're talking about only single family detached dwellings. This wouldn't apply to townhomes, it wouldn't apply to apartments. This would be single family detached dwellings. 4 chickens at 6,000 to almost 10,000 square feet, 5 to 6 for over 10,000 square feet, and finally 8 for anything larger than 12,000 square feet. And this again assumes residential zoning that's not A1 zoning, that you would already be allowed to have a certain number of chickens based on the agricultural zone itself. So this applies to single family zones, not the agriculture zone necessarily. Sorry. And then again, for coops, there are some small standards proposed based again on those responses and the research that the planning staff did. Zach was really diligent in looking through different codes from different cities to get kind of best practices. 5 feet from property lines, 25 feet for an adjacent property line setback, 10 feet from anybody's dwelling, 7 feet as a maximum for the coop height, and then some minimum 4 square feet per chicken to keep them cleaner, and that keeps them cleaner and from smelling as much, makes them easier to take care of the chickens. This is some of the data that we collected based on the other cities in the area that are allowing chickens. Most of them do. There are a few that do not. And you're going to see a lot of data in there about whether or not a permit is required. That was a significant question that we asked in the survey and when we were conducting research with other cities about how they handled their chickens. There were 16 cities in Salt Lake County reviewed. 9 of them require a permit. And on average, those cities allow for about 7 chickens. That's mostly based on lot size. So we're trying to stay right in that same vein. This is all about the coops. Again, we kind of went over that data really quickly, but we have this available for you if you want to look at it in greater detail. We feel like this represents, or what we're proposing represents the best amalgamation of this data and what seems to be working out. So when we called and did the research, we were fortunate to be behind the curve in allowing them a little bit in this case, because we could ask them what has worked out for you and what have you found is not working, and adjust our numbers accordingly. So that's what we tried to do here. Code enforcement cases, again, one of the main concerns going into it was our planning commission, when we told them we were going to be looking into it again, said, hey, we worry about the availability of enforcement personnel for this. How is it, we don't want to overwhelm code enforcement or have to hire 6 people just to go out and patrol chickens. So that was a big concern as we talked to code enforcement officials and personnel from other cities and got their numbers for cases. We felt a lot better about it after we got their numbers back. They're not actually seeing that much of an increase in code enforcement need from chickens. Most of the time, people are pretty good about it. So we did feel better about it after that. We're probably most on par with Taylorsville and Midvale. There have been a number of cases, but they're not terribly significant in terms of the numbers that we handle overall. We feel like we can absorb that. Other data we wanted to talk about just really quickly. This is a snip from the survey that was conducted. We did get more than 1,000 responses to the survey about chickens. It was a really good response. The great majority of those, 79% of those responses were in favor of allowing residential chickens, and so we did move forward with an ordinance. Of those respondents, a lot favored there being, a majority slightly favored there being no permit required for the keeping of those chickens. The Planning Commission struggled with that idea a little bit. And I'm sorry, I don't have a slide about that, but the Planning Commission struggled with that just a little bit. And although they stopped short of saying they wanted a permit requirement written into the proposed ordinance. They did propose requiring chicken owners to register with the city, so we can at least have a list, an ongoing list of addresses where there are chickens, so we have a point of reference when we get complaints, if we get complaints. Hopefully we get no complaints if anything is adopted. But in the event that we got complaints, we'd have a list to reference and say, oh yeah, Joe Jones came in 2 years ago and registered to have 4 chickens. Let's check out what's going on. So we at least have that record. That's what the Planning Commission suggested, and we have written that into the draft. So that's what we're proposing. The Planning Commission did recommend approval, but with that one small change for residential chicken keeping standards. Do you have any questions from all of that? I know that's a lot of data to go through, but.
Can I go?
Yes.
Okay. So just thank you for bringing it back and for all of the research to other cities. It's really comprehensive. And I reached out to all my chicken people, which sounds derogatory, but is not intended to be so at all. But I have a great number of neighbors who have chickens, and I only know they have chickens because in pre-COVID times, our kids were in and out of each other's yards all day long. And so, you know, I'd wander back and admire their setups. And so in speaking with them, I wonder, with looking at what's best practice in other cities, I just want to make sure I'm clear. So there is no permit in this ordinance. So does that mean there's no fee with registering, or is there a fee associated with registering?
No, there would not be a fee associated with registering. Okay. It would just be a registration for information purposes only.
Okay.
And we wouldn't frankly know if people chose to do it without registering. It wouldn't be a violation necessarily. We just would like them to voluntarily register their name.
Right. And when I reached out to people, I said, hey, look through what's being proposed. Let me know what this looks like compared to what you're doing, what would be challenging, what, you know, just trying to have that conversation. And there were several who said, oh no, I didn't even know I wasn't allowed to. And I think that that's pretty common. My one big, well, two things that caught my eye. One was the number of chickens. Especially for those under the 6,000 square feet for the lot. I live in one of those lots and I don't want chickens. My partner might, but I don't want to take care of anything else that's alive. But with that, chickens lay in cycles in their lifetimes. They don't lay their whole life long. And so that small number would mean that some wouldn't have any eggs for a certain amount of time with that small amount. And with a big focus being on you know, being able to provide for yourself, being able to, you know, teach those lessons to your family and your children. I do have that concern with the small amount with the under 6,000 square foot lot. And then my other thing is right against the property line. I understand the rationale for how many feet away from somebody else's dwelling. That makes a lot of sense to me. But as far as how many feet away from their property line, that one I'm not so sure about, because I mean, if I was to build a coop or a dog run, I'd want to use an existing fence I already have on my property line. And if I'm lucky enough that it's enough feet away from somebody else's dwelling, that seems like the ideal location to me. So if you wouldn't mind speaking to both of those, I'd love to hear.
I wish I could. I'm not the expert. I would need Zach for that. He did the research on all of this. So he'd be able to tell you why I think I do know about the structure, the coop being 5 feet off. That's because we're viewing it as an accessory structure. And generally speaking, you want it at least, although the desire might be there to use a fence or an existing wall or something as a component of that structure. That seems like a good idea in theory, but it's always a bad idea in practice because it creates drainage problems onto another property that we don't allow. So accessory structures have to be at least 1 foot from a property line. And 5 feet keeps you out of problems with building codes, although most coops are not going to be large enough to need a building permit. Yeah, I'm going to guess most of them are not going to need a building permit at 200 square feet and up. So it shouldn't be an issue, but 5 feet is kind of the magic number just to make sure that there are never any issues. We could look at shortening that, but probably not to 0.
Right. Okay.
Like accessories.
Is that similar to, I'm thinking like the dog run example or a play structure? Is there a similar code for that?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it depends on it depends on what we consider a structure. So a dog run, I'd have to look at what they proposed. Sheds and garages are typically the accessory structures that get brought up. But
Okay.
there are those lucky people who have pool houses to deal with. I hope to be one of those someday. And yeah, certainly dog runs. I've not had that come up because usually they're chain link or something like that. But people do tend to use existing walls and fences as a part of the structure. We can look at that. I'll have Zach look into it and see if they had other issues with that before it comes back to you all.
Thank you. And I probably should have emailed ahead with some of the really specific questions, but I really appreciate that. And I'll just say one more thing before I mute myself and let someone else go. I'm really grateful this is coming back. I think it's not so much a matter of allowing chickens as keeping track of them and giving educational guidance on how to keep them, and worries about pests. I mean, I don't think Chief Burnett's on this particular meeting, but is always teasing me about my rat and raccoon complaints. But I think, living where we live, those are always going to be issues, and people are already keeping them in great numbers. And if we can give some guidance and helping them be independent, I think it's great. But I'll mute and let other people ask questions or share opinions.
Councilmember Martinez, I think that's actually your comment just led into one of the reasons why we would want to keep things off of property lines, is so that there is a little bit of distance between any issues that could be created by the coop or the chickens and the property line. In particular, if a neighbor has other animals, if they have dogs and there's chickens that are kept right up against the property line, that can create some issues as well. But it's primarily a building code thing, as Jared outlined.
Diane?
Yes, go ahead.
That was, I think, remind me, Diane, you were with us, but that seemed to be the biggest concern back when we looked at it before, was that
Yes.
property line with the rats and things like that. So that was the biggest thing that came about. And it's kind of done an about face, because you said 1,000 people, Jared, were surveyed, and it was like 70-something%. Now, in my memory, Blair, you were there. My memory is not very good, but it seemed like it wasn't that high of an interest back then, but it certainly has changed. And I do have people in my area that have requested for chickens. So, but back then it didn't seem like it was that big of an interest. But I mean, it was.
You're not remembering, Brett.
There was interest, but it was not. It didn't seem like it was 70-80% like Jared's survey, and I could be wrong, but
yeah,
it was pretty high, as I remember. Yeah, but one of the issues was making sure there was enough room, as I remember, and we have them in my neighborhood. When we go walking, we hear them all the time. So, I just think it's a good idea to recognize that we have them and regulate it and make sure they're good neighbors.
Diane, would they be allowed in an area like your area?
Well, no, not in the condos, but
okay,
I have a big neighborhood.
Sure. So I'm just talking about, are they allowed in where you live?
No.
Okay.
Oh, no.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
If I might, Diane?
Yes, please.
I don't know what the right and the wrong of this is, but I'll tell you, I was raised with chickens growing up, and they do, and I think Kat talked to this a little bit, because of their droppings, because of the feed they eat, they draw rats, they draw skunks, they draw raccoons. There's chickens behind us someplace, and we just spent several $100s this year getting rid of rats that we've never had before. So, there's a reason there's agriculture areas, and Kat's right again. You get half a dozen chickens, you might get 1 or 2 eggs. I did have one constituent reach out to me, but it's been quite a while ago. But he had a child that had autism and had bonded with a chicken, and they were trying to get him to get rid of that chicken. I think those incidences are a little different than trying to raise chickens to get fresh eggs, because you'll never meet that quota with half a dozen chickens or 8 or 10 chickens, but just be really aware that there's going to be varmint problems. And I'll tell you, we tried everything we could. We made Lowe's a lot of money trying to find things to get rid of them. And finally, we just called an exterminator, and they came and got rid of the rats. But with chickens comes that type of problem. And I just want everybody to be very aware of that. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay. We will continue on. Do we have any announcements? Jan, Jennifer, whoever's.
Yeah, I just have one announcement. I just wanted to remind you guys of Jan's socially distanced retirement reception that we're going to have on January 28th from 12 to 2.
Okay. All right, sounds good. We are now adjourned. Thank you. You guys are great.
Thank you.